most people. We might be missing a couple members, but we set a 1 o'clock start. So whenever you're ready, I think.
Great. Well, I wanted to welcome everyone here. It's really challenging to have a nice warm welcome after that conversation that I jumped in on. And what I want to do is thank you all for being willing to participate in this conversation around the Clean Energy Fund and the role that it will play in helping the state achieve the ambitious clean energy goals that we have in front of us. This is part of the Clean Energy Transformation Act, and it's an important part of that. The situation that we find ourselves in now, with thinking about the response to COVID-19 and working through the civil unrest that's been caused by the murder of George Floyd, creates a really different context for us to be thinking about this work than when Kate and Brian and Jennifer and I got together to think through what we might do here. And so it's with that kind of set of responsibilities that I want to ask everybody to bring their best thinking to this conversation and to challenge each other and yourselves to think about what we need to do in the world that we're living in today. And so again, thank you for being willing to be a part of this conversation. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and talking with you about this. I want to turn it over to Alana to walk through some of the details of WebEx that I am certainly not qualified to help you with. So we'll start there. Alana, are you with us? Or Kate?
Alana, you're muted.
I can't still hear you.
Let me take my headphones out. Does that work now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, my microphone was turned on, but that must have been a headphone issue. Okay. So as I was saying, I'm Alana. I'm the admin assistant for the Energy Programs and Communities unit within the Energy Division at Commerce. And as Michael said, I'm just going to run you through a few basic functions of WebEx to help you feel a bit more at home. So when you move your mouse over your screen, you're going to see a toolbar at the bottom. The first icon is the microphone, and whoever designed this one had a cruel sense of humor because, as you might have noticed, it has a line through the microphone, whether it's turned on or turned off. So the important thing to remember is that it is gray when your microphone is on, and it will be red when your microphone is off. Another way to check is you'll see a little red microphone symbol over your name in the participants panel or over your video if your microphone is off. Throughout today's meeting, we really want to hear your feedback and have people participating as much as possible. So when people are presenting, I will mute the mics so that we can have the best audio quality. That doesn't mean that we don't want to hear from you. So don't forget to unmute your microphone if you do want to raise a question. When you finish speaking, you can just mute it again. Next to the microphone, we have got the camera button. So as you may have seen, we ask that you turn your camera on while you're speaking. Whilst people are presenting, we'll turn our cameras off. Another way to send questions is in the chat box. So if you haven't seen it already, you can open the chat box by clicking on the blue circle with the text bubble in it on your toolbar. Then you'll be able to send questions to everyone using the chat box on your screen. If you have a question, but you don't want to use the chat box or you don't want to interrupt immediately whoever's speaking, you can use the raise your hand function. So you should have a participant panel visible on the right of your screen above the chat box. If you don't see it now, you can click on the participants icon, which is the one to the left of the chat box icon in your toolbar. And then the raise your hand icon should appear when you hover your mouse over your name. If you click on the icon, it will raise your hand, which will be a signal for myself or the presenter to call on you. And then once you've posed your question or made your comment, please remember to lower your hand again by clicking on it once more. For those of you who've joined by phone, I don't know if anyone did join by phone. Yeah, I think we do have at least one call-in user. there may be no option to unmute your mic and ask questions once you've been muted. So if you'd like to have the option to participate, we respectfully ask that you log into the meeting via computer or using the WebEx app, which is available for the smartphone. So the full name of that app is on the slide that's currently on the screens. And then finally, if you have any questions about WebEx or any technical issues, feel free to message me directly in the chat. You do that by sending a private message to Commerce Energy Policy. And that's all from me, unless there are any questions from anybody. That seems good. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Kate. But again, if you do have questions, don't hesitate to ask.
Well, welcome everyone. My name is Kate Kelly, and I'm one of the co-leads on this project. I'm a senior energy policy specialist with Commerce, and among my duties, I am the policy lead for this 2021 state energy strategy that's currently being developed. So that's the bulk of my work, but I'm also going to help facilitate this meeting today. So right now, what we're going to do is go into the introduction. So that means if you can, to turn on your video and just introduce yourself and who you are. And if you are a member of the advisory committee in particular, if you could let everybody know that. And if you don't, we'll talk about it later, or if you're not sure. All right, so let's just, well, I don't know how to do this. I guess I'm just going to go in order of what I see on my screen. So maybe Dr. Wolcott, you could go first. You're muted.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Mike Wolcott. I'm at Washington State University and Associate Vice President for Research.
Okay. And another member of our advisory committee is Dr. Swisher. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, Joel Swisher from Western. I'm director of the Institute for Energy Studies.
Scott Morgan.
Yes, Scott Morgan, the Evergreen State College. I'm Director of Sustainability and currently the interim safety manager for health and safety. So I'm really excited to not talk about COVID this afternoon.
Well, we can't entirely make that promise, but we'll see what we can do. Dr. Carrier.
Good afternoon. I'm Tom Carrier. I'm a professor of economics at Eastern Washington University, and I served for 20 years on the Power and Conservation Council and worked for the last 3 governors. And thanks.
Okay, and Angela Becker-Dickman. You're muted.
There we go. So many different platforms. Angela Becker-Dittman. I'm the director of the Program Development Office for Energy and Environment at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory.
And a member of the committee. So I don't know who the call-in user is. If you want to introduce yourself. Okay.
They should be
Kate?
unmuted.
Kate, are you there?
Yep. Oh,
This is
Austin? Okay.
Yeah. Just listening in. I'm Austin Sharp, the Legislative and Rulemaking Coordinator at the Energy Division. I'm just interested in hearing the conversation today.
All right. And Dr. Schwartz.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's working? Great. Thanks. Hi, I'm Dan Schwartz. I'm professor of chemical engineering at UW, director of our Clean Energy Institute, and I believe on the committee as well. So thank you.
Yes, you are. All right. And the rest of our folks are from Department of Commerce. And so we'll just go around. Hans is playing a very important role today, and he plays an important role in the Clean Energy Fund as well. Hans, do you want to introduce yourself? He's going to be helping us with the slides, among other things.
Sure. Yeah, so my role today is definitely around support, helping with supply, definitely with the slides and providing any kind of background information as needed. And then my official role capacity as Energy Contracts and Program Supervisor, and help supervise staff that administer funds such as the Clean Energy Fund.
And Bob, you're next on my screen. And you're muted.
There, I'm unmuted. Hi, am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Anyway, I'm Bob Kirschmeyer. I work in the Energy Division. I work mostly on the Clean Energy Fund grid program, and I function primarily as a technical advisor and program manager for the grid modernization program.
Okay, and as I mentioned, we'll hear more from Bob later. Mel Clark, I apologize, I skipped over you. You're not a Commerce staff person, but an important participant in this committee. Do you mind introducing yourself?
Of course, I'm glad that I wasn't secretly assigned a second new job. My name is Mel Clark. I am the new president and CEO for Clean Tech Alliance. I have been with the organization for almost 5 weeks now. Hello.
Brian, you want to go next?
Sure. Brian Young. I am the Clean Tech Sector Lead at the Washington State Department of Commerce. I actually am the one commerce person here that doesn't work in the Energy Division, work in the Office of Economic Development and Competitiveness, and have been involved with the Clean Energy Fund for a long time, but also I think it shows how important it is to us as a state for kind of the energy side and the economics development side to work together. So that is my role. And thank you all for doing this. I spoke to a lot of you personally and appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Jennifer, you want to bring us home? Okay, you're muted still.
How about now?
That sounds good.
I thought I had it. Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Grove, and I'm the Managing Director in the Energy Programs and Communities Unit within the Energy Division. I've been in my role at Commerce for about 5 months, so a little more than you, Mel, at 5 weeks. Prior to Commerce, I led a regional nonprofit organization, Spark Northwest, working on community scale clean energy projects and implementation and policy. And I know some of you from that world, so I'm happy to see you in this forum.
Okay, I think that's everybody. If there's anybody on this call that I missed, please let us know right now. And Alana showed you how to raise your hand, or you can unmute, but I think that's everybody. So we do, Brian said it very well when he said that how much we appreciate you giving your time to this project. What we're going to do now is just go into some kind of meeting logistics and committee logistics. So we sent you some documents in advance, but just very quickly, we'll go over them. I really encourage people to just jump in with questions throughout the day. It's a small enough group that we can really do that. And so please do that. So just basically the agenda that we've got for today. Hans, if you could show maybe the whole thing on the screen or minimize it or do something so that we can scroll down on the agenda. So mostly what we're going to do besides this kind of housekeeping stuff right now is to kind of just give a primer on the state Clean Energy Fund, on Commerce's Clean Energy Fund, where it's been and start thinking about some of the areas we might want to focus on in terms of how these funds are invested, and especially given where we're at right now. And there was a background document that we sent along yesterday, and hopefully most of you had a chance to at least skim through it. I know there was a lot of materials that came at you. We're not going to go through that document today, but it was just intended to be kind of a little bit of background for those of you who wanted to learn about the genesis of this committee and the Clean Energy Fund. But we will go into that a little bit today as well. So one thing I realized as I was laying in bed last night was that we didn't put in any time for a break today. So I think I'm just going to encourage you to take your breaks as needed, and we won't mind if you do that, if you need to step away from the computer for anything, because 3 hours is a long time to sit, and we know that. So we've got a lot of speakers today, a lot of experts at the table, and so again, encourage the conversation as we go along. We do have 45 minutes set aside at the end for conversation, and really want to encourage folks to stay for that and to turn on their video for that. Dr. Delgado from Central Washington University had a class he was teaching today, so he won't be joining us until 3 o'clock, but hopefully he'll be able to participate in that conversation as well. So with that, I think, Hans, let's go to the charge, the committee charge document. So I think we'll just, I don't know if folks had a chance to look at this, but it's really just one page that we put together to kind of help guide the work of this committee a little bit. It's designed to talk about the purpose of the committee, which, as Michael talked about, it is part of the Clean Energy Transformation Act. It was included in there. The way the proviso is worded, it sounds like an ongoing committee, but the committee actually expires at the end of this year, and so we wanted to find work that was doable in the time frame that we had, and that's how we settled on the Clean Energy Fund look that we're going to be doing. So the Commerce team that you have here on this call is the team that will be supporting this work. One thing, and if you scroll down a little bit, Hans, is we are intending to have a stakeholder interim process that we're going to do for deeper dives into the three traditional program areas of the CEF. And that will be occurring after this meeting and before the next meeting of the full committee. And so that is intended to be further brainstorming exercises on where we can go with these programs. And we'll talk a lot more about that as we get into our program discussions later on in the agenda. And one of the things to point out here, and it's really the will of the committee, but the way we've got it worded here is that members will not be asked to come to consensus or to vote on any particular proposal. I think in terms of putting together recommendations from this group, we are intending to just kind of crowdsource whatever ideas we come up with, kind of screen them, talk about them, and then put them on a list. And that doesn't mean that everybody will necessarily agree to them or have to vote on them. It's just more of an exercise that we're going through. I'm very interested to talk about that if folks have thoughts on how we should conduct our business. And lastly, before I turn it over for any comments or questions, we've listed the members at the end of this document on the second page, and we Alana and I tried to make a good search of the proper titles for all of the esteemed members we have on this committee, but many of you bear multiple titles and roles. And so if we didn't capture your title correctly, please let us know. We want to be respectful in this document and make sure we capture what your director or professor or vice president of, and et cetera. So please let us know. Are there any comments, suggestions, thoughts that anyone wants to share on this document? Okay. All right. Seeing none. And Alana, you don't see anything either, do you?
No, I don't see any questions or comments.
Okay. All right. So Hans, why don't we put the schedule up just real quickly and we can just run through that. Okay. So this is draft. This is much like the charter before it. This is a proposed schedule for the work of this committee. We have a pretty tight time frame, which in some ways is good because it drives us to do the work. Number one, we're driven by the fact that this report needs to be submitted to the legislature by the end of December. But we're also being driven by the fact that the deadlines for meaningful input into legislative budgets come up much sooner than the legislature actually meets. And so it's to make sure that the outcome from this committee work and the stakeholder sessions gets incorporated timely into at least the main legislative session. We need to drive on a pretty hard schedule. So, and if there's special sessions, that adds a whole new wrinkle to it, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. So what we're intending to do is kind of spend the month of June and probably the first week or two in July doing these deeper dive stakeholder sessions, and then come back together as a full group in July and have a report out of those sessions, and then have some kind of a stakeholder process where we put out some kind of draft recommendations, hopefully by August, and then meet again as a full committee to kind of finalize things late in August so that we can run it through the proper process, which does include a governor's office review in order to get the document to the legislature.
Kate, if that's a good point to pause, I see that Michael Walcott did have his hand raised. Do you have a question, Michael?
Yeah, hi Kate. So I think Kate answered my question. Actually, this is going in the governor's budget. So that is
okay, perfect.
Well, it will have, it will be factored into the governor's budget. We'll be submitting it hopefully to be considered. I don't know, Michael Furs, do you have thoughts on the timing that we should share related to that question?
Yeah, so the question of it going into the governor's budget, I think that the intent is the intent behind this process was that the Clean Energy Fund has been around for now its fourth biennium, and it's a good opportunity to take a look at where we want it to go. The intentions that we've had have kept a pretty consistent flavor through three traditional programs: grid modernization, RD&D, and grants to nonprofit lenders. And there have been some other pieces along the way. We've learned a lot. The trajectory to get to the goals of the Clean Energy Transformation Act is now ahead of us. We've got this policy document that will be developed through the State Energy Strategy. And so we're asking the question, where does the Clean Energy Fund need to go? We're both kind of caught in this catch-22 where we get these categories that are every biennium a little bit different, which require us to do a lot of programmatic design work. That takes a lot of time, and we hear from legislators that they don't know what they're necessarily buying with the Clean Energy Fund document. So we want to simultaneously get flexibility, because some of the feedback that I hear is that, you know, my project's kind of between two of these buckets. Where should it go? So how do we create flexibility on the one hand and give legislators a better sense of what they are buying with that at the same time? And so taking that consideration, the ideas that you and the stakeholder committees give to us will lead to us repackaging the Clean Energy Fund potentially in order to achieve those goals. And so that those ideas would become something that Commerce pushes forward through the governor's budget. And then, like always, will be subject to the legislative process. That's how I see the intent and the question.
Yeah, that was very helpful. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks for asking it.
And we'll have a chance to revisit this schedule again at the end of the session later on this afternoon when we kind of have an open discussion. And if there are thoughts on this meeting schedule or the process we're using, you know, we're definitely open to it. We just wanted to make sure we put on paper some of our ideas for how we see this work might go and might have a successful outcome. Okay. Well, that concludes my part of this agenda, and we're ahead of schedule, which is really cool. So, Michael, if you're ready, I'll turn it up to you.
Yeah. All right. So it looks like PowerPoint is coming up. So my name's Michael Furze, and I'm an assistant director, member of the executive team here at the Department of Commerce, and the team that I lead is the Energy Division. And again, as I've done before, I want to thank you for agreeing to be part of this process. Even in this virtual environment, this group already seemed to be getting to know each other. I know you've got relationships outside of this committee that you're bringing to the table. I think I'm looking forward to really kind of a fun and lively conversation. And as I've said previously, just looking for your help so that we can figure out the trajectory of the Clean Energy Fund so that we can meet the climate goals that we have and support our economy at the same time. I don't know if I have control over this presentation, so I'm going to push buttons and see what happens. I do not appear to have control, so if you can go to the next slide. For those of you that know Commerce, I think you probably know a little bit about the Energy Division, maybe some of the policy work we do, maybe the Clean Energy Fund. You probably know Brian Young really well. As he said, not in the Energy Division, but a really strong partner. Commerce as a whole has got about 95 different programs, and we are the state agency Swiss Army knife for strengthening communities in our state. We do things from international economic trade to providing services for crime victims, affordable housing, local government infrastructure, energy policy and programs. So it's quite a wide array of services that we're able to provide for folks that need it. And if you go to the next slide, I know that some of you are very familiar with what we're trying to do for the Clean Energy Fund. And I have found that it is usually a mistake to jump into the deep end and try and wrap my mind around the energy universe by talking about microgrids. And so what I want to do is kind of set the table for how we got here. The legacy grid, you know, we're still in the infancy of the transition from one-way power flows to a more dynamic system. I've heard it said that there's no way that Alexander Graham Bell could identify a telephone that we're all walking around with in our pockets, but that Thomas Edison would have a pretty easy idea to be able to figure out what the infrastructure of the grid is right now. And So if you go to the next slide, it looks at the future that we're striving for, trying to think about these two-way power flows and energy showing up in communities in different ways, and people engaging with this magic infrastructure in ways that that Edison probably wouldn't have thought of. And so we know where we're headed with this clean energy future. We know that buildings and homes are going to be more ingrained in the process. We know that the cloud is going to play a role in optimizing the performance of the grid. We know that we're going to need the ability to store lots more power than we can right now. There'll be different ways to connect buildings and districts and automobiles to the system that we think we might be able to see the future direction, but we don't really know exactly where that's going to go. And on the next slide, it shows the reasons that we're making this change, confronting the existential threat that climate change poses for us and for the planet. We've got the legacy grid and both its inability to provide for the type of flexibility that we need and also the age of that infrastructure. We need to manage the risk that that we have as the folks that are responsible for spending state funds. The risk that utilities will face by bringing on new systems, the risks that communities are facing from reduced resiliency. There's going to be increased demand on the electrical grid. We've got these traditional generating sources that the system was built around that are retiring. And we've got new game-changing clean energy technologies that are being developed in Washington and taken globally, and some that are developed elsewhere and coming here. Next slide, please. So the targets in front of us, Clean Energy Transformation Act tells us how we're going to get our energy from non-emitting sources in 2045, and we're already on a pretty strong path to get there by 2030. There are some utilities that have got to do more in the short term, others that have to do less. But the last increment, as we all know, is always the hardest part, and so we want to. We've been using the Clean Energy Fund to try and move through some of these technological hurdles and to get really good ideas out of the minds of academics and researchers, out of the lab and onto the grid, so we can figure out what works on our grid, what does not work, and how do we iterate and build the next key component that will help us move forward to solve the next problem. And we've got lots of really excellent resources that many other states do not have. Folks are here representing TNNL and UW, WSU, and each of the institutions that you represent are strong partners for us in solving those problems. And we'll be getting more assets in the near future with the grid storage lab that's coming to the Tri-Cities, but that won't be here. That won't be here for a little while. So we've got these really aggressive goals, and we've got lots of strong contributors with great ideas, and we've got a little bit of funding to help us get there. Can you go to the next slide? So some pretty significant challenges to get from this legacy grid to the more complex and dynamic grid on the right side of this graph. The transition is going to require changes that are well beyond the Clean Energy Fund and the policy framework that is the responsibility of the Department of Commerce. It brings in, the utilities themselves, whether they're public or private, brings in the folks that regulate them. We've got unprecedented changes for consumers and businesses, and a lot of it is undecided. The intent that we've got at the Department of Commerce as we're strengthening communities is to try and find ways to empower communities to be part of these decisions and help them bring the grid of the future into their communities in a way that makes sense for them. Last part that I think is really important to cover is that the way in which the Clean Energy Fund is funded is this kind of irregular, specific proviso by proviso approach within the state capital budget, which I know there was a comment earlier about shifting focus from energy work to COVID response. I did that for 10 weeks or so. Also very happy to be talking about energy. it's challenging to convert the clean energy work that we're doing into the language and thought process of budget writers, whether they're at the staff level, within the executive branch, or the legislative. It's just a tricky proposition to get from A to B. And that has led to these different iterations through the 4 Clean Energy Fund budgets, and then there are some kind of supplemental budgets that have moved pieces around, and it's not a very clean process. It would be wonderful to have a dedicated revenue source that we could use to fund these projects. It's just something to consider as we're thinking about these programs. If you go to the next slide, you get this beautiful picture of the State House, the territory where we're having these conversations. It's just, it's a consideration that every time we change a word or move a comma, it really does have, it prevents us from simply going back out with the same sort of program that we had previously. It leads to significant effort from staff and stakeholders to design specific programs, and it prevents the type of support that we want to provide innovators by having to fit them into one category or the other or the other. If you go to the next slide. Moving out of the budget range, again, part of the complexity is that budget writers are very comfortable thinking about roads or traditional infrastructure. We've got money, we've got a project design, we build it lasts for 30 years or so. And what we're trying to do with the Clean Energy Fund, obviously, is different. That we've got R&D that's going on, some of which we're able to support. We get that out of the lab, we start to demonstrate feasibility, or we demonstrate design solutions that are not going to be feasible, and the next effort becomes the one that is more feasible than the previous, and then kind of implement those solutions at scale. And that's what this fund is all about. And on the last slide, right, this is not the product of the Department of Commerce solely. The next slide, please, shows these partners. And back one, the Clean Tech Alliance and the folks, the entrepreneurs that come in and request funding from us, whether they get it or don't, are a key part of this. Educational institutions are both helping with the research and producing entrepreneurs that we are able to fund with this work. We've got both local governments, state agencies, and nonprofits that are playing a role. Clearly, utilities are a partner of ours, and we're looking to do as much work with tribes and vulnerable communities as we possibly can. So at a high level, that's the story of what the Clean Energy Fund is doing. I think you can trace it all the way back to Initiative 937, when the first shift was made out of traditional generating resources into bringing in intermittent renewables. And so the race to figure out how to best do that has been part of the process ever since. We've had really strong partnerships with the folks that are both on the slide, the organizations that you all are representing, and the Federal Department of Energy, both through the stimulus and through the Office of Electricity and ERE. And so there's a lot that's gone into the Clean Energy Fund to get us here, and I look forward to working with you to get us to the next level. Thank you.
So we'll open it up for any questions for Michael about all that. That was a lot all at once. Or if anybody from Commerce has anything to add at this point. All right, hearing none.
Okay,
yes.
It's like Dan and Michael Wolcott both had questions. Dan, why don't you go first?
Thanks. I'm interested how you think about the spectrum of risk that the state, the funders, the partners are willing to take, from the RD&D up to, well, many of the programs that you've talked to just what is the appetite for risk for projects? You had mentioned, Michael, that sometimes the first iteration you build it, and it's going to be the second iteration that is going to be the successful version. And for those of us on the higher ed side of things, that's totally acceptable risk. You try stuff and it doesn't work. So I'm just curious if you could talk about the appetite for risk, the spectrum of risk that is there for projects to succeed or fail.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'm not going to give you a specific answer because I don't have a matrix in front of me or a rubric to use. I think I look at the spectrum of personalities and talents and skills on the team, many of which are assembled here. And I think we have a good balance of risk-averse personalities, folks with a lot of deep experience about what's reasonable and what's not. I think we get a good dose of what the business community thinks through our partnership with Brian. Honestly, the idea about talking about failure and either projects failing or not being able to work as designed is really something that I've had to come to terms with. When I started in the Clean Energy Fund, or when I started in the role as the Assistant Director for Energy, the first week, the headline of the Seattle Times was Governor's Clean Energy Fund implicated in ethics scandal. And so that process moved forward. It was found not to be any ethical violations. But that really was the mindset that I had starting out is, okay, let's run this on the straight and narrow and make sure that we're doing the best we can with state dollars. I think that's the expectation that I had for the team and that we have for using those funds. And as I've spent 4 or 5 years doing this work, it's become clear to me that this is on the edge of what governments typically fund. I think many states, even some legislators and budget staff, are less comfortable with what we do in this program because there's not an obvious one-to-one correspondence between dollars spent and overall impact. And so the way that we mitigate that is by bringing in groups of experts to sort through the proposals and get a sense of where they are on the readiness scale and try and do our best to select applicants that will give the state the type of return that we're looking for in terms of the clean energy potential of these projects. I think it's easier maybe in the grid modernization space because we have someone like Bob Kirschmeyer with all of his experience to be able to work with utilities. It's a little bit trickier in the RD&D space, which has traditionally been much wider. So that's the approach that we take to balancing it. I don't think that there's a hard line that we draw upon in order to make those decisions, other than the ability to assemble a strong team and pass muster with experts who are doing the reviews.
Thanks.
Okay, so Michael, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so thanks, Michael, on this. This is a very helpful presentation. So I actually had 2 questions, and one of them was sort of in the line that Dan just talked about, and I guess I just add one comment that I think, oftentimes in these types of programs, whether it's federal or state, that there's this sort of idea that, boy, if the government really invests in something, then it has to be successful and go forward. And obviously that is the goal, right? We don't want to invest in things that are going to fail. But I think the role of government obviously is to remove risk from the business development. Otherwise, we wouldn't need to do that, right? I mean, there's no need for a program if the program's going to 100%, win. So I think that understanding that level of acceptable risk and where that sort of sits is really an important piece to that. And obviously, I don't know what the line is right here or now. As you indicated, there's not a rubric for this, but it certainly is something that's important to discuss within there, I think. For the effectiveness of the program as a whole, and we're going to get some failures, and so how do we get the most wins out of those in those areas where we're mitigating risk for companies? But the other question that I had was that obviously your talk really focused on electricity or power, and more specifically on power generation and distribution. And that's not the only energy climate that we have within the state. And obviously grid is a big piece of the Clean Energy Fund, and Washington's been historically an electricity state, right? It's the founding of this from our dams and whatnot going forward on this. But I guess my question is that were these just examples, or are we to focus on this as opposed to, say, heat or liquid fuels, things along this line? Is the intent on this going forward to be really focused on power, or are we to look at sort of the energy needs more holistically?
That's a great question. I think that the latter of your two formulations makes sense to me. We want to, in terms of this conversation, let's think about it broadly. The presentation I gave is one that we've developed really just to kind of ground anything that we're doing in a particular space, and it easily connects to other work that we're doing with SETA, State Energy Strategy, that sort of thing. I think that we've been successful in bringing state and federal funding in to further enhance work we're doing around the grid. We know that there's going to be a massive transformation, and so I wouldn't want to lose focus there. We've also funded many projects, typically in the RD&D space, where it's outside of the construct that I gave you in terms of that presentation. So I don't think it needs to be narrowly subscribed around the grid.
Great, thanks, Michael.
One thing we're doing, the Michael referenced 3 primary program areas where the clean energy funds have been generally focused over the years. And those 3 programs have very particular names. And one of the things we're doing as part of this exercise with this committee and then the stakeholder sessions that we're having is to kind of relabel those buckets and program areas so that to allow for that kind of innovative thinking and kind of expanding the boundaries of where we might have limited the programs in the past, and what other ideas can we have for investment that might better accommodate the current energy landscape, the current economic landscape, and just where we want to go in terms of climate goals. So you'll see that.
Right, and I think when you look at sort of the role that the program has played with grid and successes, Michael, that you put forward on those, are it's because you had large entities, and I think those projects are really aimed at mitigating the risk that they have and bringing more renewables on the grid, or dealing with new systems to balance sort of load and generation on these things, and ease on the distribution, modernize in those areas. So those are those are really successful because we had groups that were really targeted. The programs were very targeted at those types of efforts along the way for that, and so it was very effective. And then when you look at the other energy space, it was kind of in the RD&D space of that, right? Because the grid was this whole separate program in that aspect. So then everything else got lumped into RD&D, which sometimes brought you to a much more speculative sort of area and not sort of a more concerted look at how you mitigate the risk of those other sector areas that we're trying to decarbonize or whatnot along the line for that. So it's just a quick observation. Obviously, this is part of our job, right? So this is going to play out over the period of this sort of thing, but that's just some thinking I was doing as I was looking at your presentation. So.
Thank you.
I see a couple more hands, so just in order of when they went up. Bob, if you'd like to speak first, and then we'll have Mel.
Yeah, this is Bob. Can you hear me all pretty well?
Yeah, sounds good, Bob.
Okay. Yeah, I was put my hand up when Dan Schwartz was asking his question about risk. Just an example of how that has gone. In the very beginning of Clean Energy Fund, the part that was targeted towards utilities, it was fairly prescriptive as far as what kind of technologies and integration requirements or how it aligned with intermittent renewables, and I'll talk about that later. But we did choose projects that had a variety of different types of chemistries and technologies. Some of you may be familiar with that. Some of those were forms of lithium-based or lithium-ion-based technologies that come out of other industries, primarily transportation. And then we also did several projects that involve some new emerging technology using vanadium redox flow type technology, which is very, very different from the lithium ion base. And we evaluated it and tested it, and we found that some of that technology had some, issues with availability and safety, and it's allowed not only us to learn about how to implement that technology, but it's allowed the manufacturers to further improve their product and evolve it. And the lessons we learned from that first round of projects were very well reflected in the second round of projects, which are now currently all being implemented with additional degrees of complexity. So, and I think we will see that as we go forward into the third round of projects and the fourth, and whatever labels we give them. So it's a progression process. And one of the aspects of the program, as far as, try it, verify it, learn from it, both the failures and the successes, and then apply that to the next iteration, is that the timeline for implementing these and getting the results is much longer than a 2-year period between legislative sessions. And so, we're still working on projects that were, conceived in 2015 and just now finally getting commissioned. And so, that is very challenging to work with the legislative process, and especially if there's increased concern about risk. So I think we have to be willing to take that risk and understand that there's going to be failures, but we also need to learn how to go through that process in a somewhat accelerated timeline. In other words, we need to sometimes do fast failures because that's where we learn the most.
Okay, are there other questions?
Yeah, Mel had a question, I believe. And then just a reminder, when you're done with your questions, if you could put your hands down, that would help us keep track.
I just wanted to dig into a tiny bit the gulf between R&D and demonstrating feasibility and implementation at scale. I know we hear from member companies and those that participate in our accelerator and other organizations that chasm is harder to cross than you might expect, particularly in the clean tech sector. And I wonder if there's room for any CEF program support for that early and mid-stage commercialization. Just because something's been demonstrated it's feasible doesn't mean it's going to get adopted and implemented and start to make the change we want to see in our communities. And I wonder if there's room as we reframe or rebucket some of these funding programs to create opportunities to support something that has been demonstrated as feasible, but still hasn't been adopted.
Thanks, Mel. I think, Brian, I'd be curious to about your response here. I mean, I think that's part of the reason that we're here, is to get to hear that feedback, to get a sense of, what are the challenges that we have not been able to confront, and then let's sort through how we might be able to get there, and then prioritize those different approaches. The only thing that comes to mind about a challenge there is just like, state capital funding has got these set of rules, Department of Energy funding has got this sort of rules. I don't quite have in my head a perfectly sequenced, like, who funds what and where those gaps are and the complexity of merging those fund sources. But to me, the idea seems like a good start to the conversation. Brian, it's your great.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've actually got to have a call with Hans about this tomorrow. But commercialization, right now, some of the language actually prohibits commercialization on some of the, or projects for commercialization. I don't know how to deal with it exactly. I will tell you some of the genesis of how it happened. Some of that came from, like, I think it's Department of Energy uses this idea of commercial. If it's been commercialized 3 times, then it's not, or if it's been done 3 times, that's no longer innovative and somebody else can fund that. So I think that was some of that early stuff. We were trying to get at things that hadn't been commercialized or demonstrated multiple times, just to to try to push it back towards that innovation side. So making sure that we didn't just get a lot, because you can imagine a lot of projects that would be shovel ready, would be capital projects, and would probably be very needed for our energy future. Lots more solar facilities or different off the shelf technologies. We are trying to avoid that because we figured we had a limited pot of money. We can only do so much with it. So we were really trying to stick to that innovation side. I'll talk a little bit more about it when I get up there, but that is a good point. A lot of these things, there's what the law has said we have to do, and then there's the programs we've designed around it, and we have some flexibility in there. So I think like commercialization in particular, I don't think is written into the law being against commercialization. It's something I think that we decided to do for good reasons. So we can discuss it. We don't have to do it.
Alana, do we have more questions?
It doesn't look like it at the moment, no.
Okay, well, see, now we're on schedule. So that worked out. Jennifer, are you ready to go?
I am here. I'm turning on my video. Looks like Hans is pulling up the slides. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good. Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
All right, success. So now that we've got your brains warmed up, another topic and consideration that we'd love to hear the advisory committee weigh in on as you think about reformulating the Clean Energy Fund and what it could do is around equity and the clean energy transition. So Michael, when he started our conversation today, mentioned and talked about the challenging time that we're living in right now, dealing with a health pandemic, racial inequality, and economic instability. And these inequalities, these same inequalities intersect with climate change, and climate change only intensifies these disparities. We know that there are disproportionate impacts that climate change has on low income and communities of color and tribal nations. And it's something that Commerce in the state recognizes and is making attempts to address. So I'd like to, oh, sorry, you can advance the slide, Hans. So at the same time that the state is recognizing this growing awareness and need, communities across our state are also stepping forward to advocate for their desire to have an active role in shaping their energy future and ensuring there is truly equitable distribution of the cost, but more importantly, the benefits of the clean energy economy, and really advocating to become active participants in strengthening community resiliency. At the state level, some of the traditional tools that we have used to address inequities in the energy system have primarily been focused on low-income energy assistance and weatherization programs. These are important programs, but at the same time, we recognize that energy equity requires a more comprehensive approach. And there are just an abundant amount of opportunities for these communities to participate in the clean energy economy, or green economy, if you will. Some of the steps that the state is taking to be more deliberate around policies and programs in this arena is identifying and prioritizing environmentally impacted and vulnerable communities, enhancing meaningful community involvement in regulatory and siting processes and decision-making, and starting to look at how we can really go about co-creating programs to ensure policy actions and funding take into account the needs and disparities that our underrepresented communities experience today. You can advance the slide. In recent years, very recent years, the legislature has adopted specific language around equity and considerations in both statutes and funding. With the Clean Energy Transformation Act, this is the language that was passed and adopted. And CETA includes, when I say CETA, Clean Energy Transformation Act, includes several provisions designed to incorporate equity considerations to meet our 100% clean electricity goals. Among other things, utilities must consider energy and non-energy benefits for the costs to vulnerable populations and highly impacted communities in their resource planning and clean energy planning. They also must mitigate energy burdens and factor in the adequacy of their existing energy assistance programs. Commerce is working really closely with the UTC, environmental justice, and low-income partners and stakeholders right now involved in quite a significant effort to adopt guidance and rules to operationalize the CETA requirements. So that is ongoing work that has begun and will continue to go for quite some time. Advance the slide. Specifically with the Clean Energy Fund, the state most recently in the 2019 session incorporated environmental justice principles in the Clean Energy Fund program as well. In 2019, they passed a new language that's prevailing language for all CEF grant programs, where priority must be given to projects that benefit vulnerable populations, tribes, and communities with high environmental or energy burden. Next slide. So what could this look like? So with equity and solar, I've got a slide here where in 2019, environmental justice and climate advocates were successful in getting new language adopted in a section of CEF to support increased access to solar through community solar projects. Within CEF, there is an allocation of the fund that is specifically for community solar projects that provide benefit to low-income households, low-income tribal housing organizations, and affordable housing providers, and also nonprofit organizations that provide services to low-income communities. So that could be a community action agency. Right now, we are currently wrapping up stakeholder outreach around this program, the current CEF program, and we'll be launching the next cycle later this year. So we'll have more information about how well the program's been designed to meet the intent of this language. The photos I have here are from actual community solar projects that I personally was involved in. One is on Capitol Hill Housing. It's an affordable housing provider in Seattle. That's the upper photo with affordable solar on. That's a community solar project providing power to the affordable housing site in partnership with Seattle City Light. And the other photo is taken from the Spokane Indian Nation, where they've been installing quite a bit of solar on different tribal facilities and are now pursuing community solar projects. So those two projects were not able to benefit from Clean Energy Fund funding because they happened before it, but those are the types of projects that could benefit in the future. Can I advance the slide? Another area where we are adapting CEF grant program design to incorporate equity principles is with electrification of transportation. So we currently have a solicitation that is out in the street right now accepting applications for the first round of CEF electrification transportation grants. We intentionally took a look at that grant program to examine areas where we could lower the barrier and increase access for vulnerable populations and highly impacted communities. Some of the things that we've done programmatically to do that is reduce the match eligibility. And the way that we're doing that is basing match on a variety of different indicators, from the project characteristics, where the project's going to be sited, environmental disparities and burden of that project site or location or the community that it's serving, and socioeconomic factors. So the higher the cumulative impacts of all those indicators, then the lower the match. Traditionally, the CEF grants have required a one-to-one match, but with electrification, this is the first grant cycle where we've looked at ways we could reduce that match barrier for specific communities. We're also adapted our scoring metric and criteria and taking a look at a bunch of different metrics that we hadn't previously taken into account, such as environmental exposures, transportation cost, area media income, rural status, etc. We also asked applicants to this program to give us an equity narrative. So we wanted to take a look at the qualitative data, but also ask for some quantitative around what the direct and indirect benefits to the community would be of the proposed project, and how meaningfully they engaged with the affected community, and to ensure that their proposal actually reflects the desire and needs of that community. We're also started conducting, we've done some targeted and tailored outreach to tribal and community of color partners at Commerce. And we were planning to do more of a roadshow and face-to-face community sessions out in tribal communities and more rural and low-income communities. And then COVID happened, so we had to alter our outreach approach on this program and do more webinars, and weren't able to do as much face-to-face sessions as we'd like to. But that's just a few examples that I wanted to share. And I want to underscore that we are just starting to think about this work and the intersection of equity and clean energy, specifically with the Clean Energy Fund. And we recognize that more work needs to be done and will be done, but I really encourage the advisory committee, and we'll be encouraging the stakeholders in our sessions to employ an equity lens when they're coming up with strategies and taking a look at historical distributions and where we might target distributions in the future. So I will pause. I'd also like to invite my colleagues at Commerce to contribute to this topic or add anything that they would like to say.
Alana, do we have any questions or comments anybody wants to share?
I don't see any hands up, but people can speak up.
Hi, this is Dan Schwartz.
Yeah.
Hi there. Hi, Jennifer. How are you? I'll tell you, the equity part is one of the things that I find a little frustrating, because our state has grown so many awesome programs, but they're siloed. I think of the workforce development work that Career Connected Washington that Maud Dodon is doing, and others, that if we could put together programs on workforce development projects like you were just talking about and other things, I can tell you Yakima Power and Yakima Forest Products have an air quality issue because of well, they need to modernize heat and power, and Yakima Power would love to have some of the workforce development things that would go along with a clean energy solution. And we have programs that are bits of programs in different spots that, if there were ways to synthesize them together easily, in timing, in resources, with common goals, the state could get $2 for every one of those dollars in individual programs by putting them together in creative ways. And I know that's not your purview here, but I will just say that our state has grown many really great programs, and we still have them kind of siloed in ways that makes it hard to get the full leverage out of all those things. I'll be quiet with that.
Well, you don't need to be quiet, but I completely agree with you, Dan. And I wonder, is Michael still with us? I can't see the attendee screen in my view.
No, he'll be back, but he's not here right now.
Okay. He is participating in the state environmental justice task force that is doing some of that work. I know they've just started really digging into that work at the beginning of this year, and will continue doing that work. Oh, and Sarah Vorpal jumped in. Sarah is also on that committee. Sarah, I don't know if you heard Daniel, but I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about the Environmental Justice Task Force work.
And Sarah, you probably need to introduce yourself too.
Yes, sorry, put you on the spot.
Not to me, but maybe to the others.
Or just come off mute. You don't have to worry about video.
Sorry, I was talking. I always forget there's 2 mute buttons when I call in on my phone. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So my name is Sarah Vorpal, and I work at the State Energy Office on Distributed Energy Resources. And I actually know Dan Schwartz very well. He was my mentor and champion when I got my PhD at the Clean Energy Institute. So also really coming from a background thinking about, the commercialization of energy materials as well. And so I have the honor right now of being on the Environmental Justice Task Force, which Commerce is a named participant in. Michael Furze is our main representative on the task force itself. I'm actually working on 2 subcommittees, one of which is looking at how we can use this mapping, these mapping tools that we have that look at these environmental health disparities and really operationalize them in state agency work. So the task force itself is trying to create a logic model and guidance for state agencies, but really you could put in any large bureaucratic institution, so utilities, academics, et cetera, to operationalize equity and really make sure that it's centered as we make these really technical decisions and program design. So just a wealth of ideas that are coming out of that. But, I think, Dan, to your point, this job, this piece that we have all these siloed bits and that, things like jobs don't get folded in is really about, the way that we're able to talk about equity in our program design and how we're able to consider something like jobs as, something that we should be incentivizing in the programs we take up. So I'm excited for this group to talk about how we can do that in a robust way and really create it as part of an integral piece of the Clean Energy Fund.
Thanks, both of you.
Okay, Alana, if there aren't any more questions or comments, we can,
Yeah, no, I don't see any other hands or comments.
Okay, well, Jennifer's going to continue to have the floor. She's just going to move into another presentation.
All right. We can talk more about risk, tolerance of risk in clean energy lending. So what we're going to move into next is we're going to introduce you all to the traditional kind of 3 buckets of areas that the Clean Energy Fund has made investments in the past. We've purposely rebranded them outside of the fund. So clean energy lending, also known as grants to nonprofit lenders, because we want to not be stuck in that legacy thinking, although it should absolutely inform our future thinking. But we want to make sure that folks feel that they can go outside of that and think creatively and innovatively to what we think needs to happen with these investments. So I'm going to just orient you and give you a little bit of grounding in what this program area, clean energy lending, has looked like to date, so you have a better foundation in which to work off of. Advance. Next slide, please. Great. So This program, really the genesis of it is, or intent is to bridge funding gap to support widespread adoption of proven, so I'm going to emphasize proven technologies. So these are fully commercialized technologies. These are not RD&D or close to commercialization. So it's energy efficiency, renewable energy, and recently the inclusion of transportation electrification. The program was conceived during the last recession to provide inexpensive capital to lenders, really to deploy tried and true clean energy technologies to consumers, small businesses, industrial customers who otherwise would lack capital, or if they're individuals, the credit score to qualify for traditional loan or traditional lending. Another component of this fund is that the grants allows and has only traditionally been available to nonprofit lenders, but it creates a revolving loan fund that includes leveraging with private investment. So this fund can be utilized many times over. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the legislature authorized lender support programs in 2009 with the Recovery Act and ARA. That really set the stage. So that was pre-CEF, but it really did set the stage to create a capital funded program around lending, which was incorporated with the first round of CEF in 2013. As I mentioned before, the program historically has been offered only to, or I would say exclusively to, nonprofit lenders serving the clean energy sector. The lender themselves, it's up to them to conduct their own due diligence and do all the financial underwriting. But they have built a portfolio of pretty high quality loans where we've seen very minimal defaults on the clean energy loans. So the grants are truly available to revolve and loans are getting repaid. The loans address multiple market sectors that are being offered by the grantees, from small businesses to nonprofit organizations, multifamily property owners, homeowners, all entities that are interested in making clean energy investments, everything from retrofits to, adopting new clean energy technology in manufacturing. As mentioned, and I'll show you a little bit more, I'll go a little deeper on the leveraging, but these are highly leveraged funds. They a wide geographic reach. I think there's a clean energy lender that's operating in every county in Washington under this program. And as I mentioned before, really very minimal defaults on these loans. Next slide, please. So here's a look at the historical funding for this program area. As I mentioned, it was part of the very first CEF round in 2013, and it was reappropriated in CEF2, CEF3, and CEF4. So it's been with every CEF round. The total appropriation over all these 4 rounds has been around $31 million. And for every dollar invested, it's matched or leveraged by $6 or more. So that's $6 is actually a little probably on the conservative side. And all of this investment has catalyzed on an order of at least probably more 5,000 projects by our count that have been deployed into communities, generating clean energy or saving money through energy efficiency. Next slide, please. So this is a look at what the current grantee portfolio looks like. Craft Free is one of the larger grantees. They are a CDFI. They do everything from residential to commercial to multifamily housing lending. They offer on-bill repayment in partnership with local utilities. And they do have some unique opportunities for low-income households who might be credit challenged to participate in their loan programs and clean energy specific products that they offer. Another grantee is Puget Sound Cooperative Credit Union. They're a cooperative credit union, I think really the only traditional or bank in the three of the grantees. They do residential loans, everything from heating and cooling to solar. They have done the most solar loans of any bank in the state. I think they've done over 7,000 homeowner solar loans. And they also offer on-bill repayment mechanisms through utility bills. And then the third grantee is Washington State Housing Finance Commission. So I think quasi-governmental, publicly accountable agency. And they've focused their Sustainable Energy Trust Fund on new construction of really high efficiency single-family homes, energy upgrades for multifamily properties, and nonprofit facilities. And then they also offer low interest loans for clean energy projects, both to property owners and developers of clean energy projects. So I want to take a closer look, just drilling down even further with one of our grantees, Craft 3. Next slide, please. This is just a quick view of over the 27 million in clean energy funds that they've received and deployed over 3 different rounds, how it's been distributed out into projects into the community. So a large part of their lending has taken place with commercial and single family homes. Multifamily is a lot more complex and challenging to finance around clean energy, but there are a few projects there. Next slide, please. And this just gives you a glimpse of the leveraging. They do. Oh, I could see that question live. The lenders do operate across the state. I think that was a question. This is just
it was, do these lenders operate in all parts of the state? That's correct.
Yes. Yeah. Puget Sound Cooperative Credit Union doesn't have physical banks across the state, but they will do projects statewide in Craft 3 as well, and same with Washington State Housing Finance Commission. This is a pie chart just to show you the leveraging for Craft 3. Of the 27 million that I mentioned before that they've received through CEF, they've leveraged that with outside investment, private investment of over 154 million. Next slide, please. So going even deeper, this is what it looks like in the community. So when those dollars get out into the community, and I picked this project because my daughter is a budding soccer player. Well, she is a soccer player, maybe a budding soccer star. And it's just a very, it's a real project in a real community in Vancouver, Washington, where the Washington Timbers, not to be confused with the Portland Timbers, but on our side of the border, the Washington Timbers team football club got lighting upgrades to pay for more energy efficient lighting on the playing field that reduced their cost by 50%. So that's just, there's just a whole suite of projects and success stories like this from our lenders. Another one is Zilla Oaks Inn in the Yakima Valley. That's a small inn run by a couple out there that installed solar energy and did energy efficiency upgrades at the end. And the solar is producing or can produce or offset 90% of the energy needs. And you can take a look at how those funds were also leveraged quite extensively. Next slide. So some considerations for the future that the stakeholder session and group that consists of folks active in the clean energy lending space, financing space, as well as environmental justice advocates. We will be taking a look at and discussing some new language that was introduced in 2019 and again altered in a short 2020 session, specifically for clean energy lending, where there's language that you see here that the grants and lending should be for the benefit of households with high energy burden or environmental health risks inhibited by lack of access to capital. So taking a look at what does that mean? What does that look like? How would that change any of the lending that's being currently done today? So that's new language that was just recently adopted. I think another consideration and that we've heard is the leveraging ratio. What's the right mix? Getting back to a little bit of that risk question and discussion you all were having earlier. What's the right mix of state funds, private funds? What's the role of the state? What's the role of the lenders that participate in CEF programs to mitigate risk? And what would that ratio look like? New technologies are constantly emerging. How, as I mentioned before, this fund has, or this program of the fund has focused on the tried and true technologies. So how does this program adapt to help bring to market some technologies that are ready to be, are commercially available, but maybe haven't had widespread adoption in the marketplace yet? Eligibility of these grants has been, as I mentioned, limited to nonprofit entities so far to date. You know, we've received questions in the past if a public utility offers a loan program for energy, would they be eligible for these funds? Should other entities that aren't strictly nonprofit entities be eligible? How expansive, how limited is that definition? Those are things that will be considered. And then I probably should have, this is not on the slide, but this is probably the first consideration is just around the economic stimulus. As I mentioned, this program was really born out of the last recession. And so now that we're in another recession, what is the role of lending and clean energy fund in the current recession and pulling out of the recession where risk tolerance is quite low, economic instability is high, unemployment rates are rising, access to capital is just getting harder. So the need for lending could be significantly higher. But what format should that take and how should it be targeted? So those are just a few of the considerations and questions that the stakeholder session that I'm leading will start deliberating on. Yeah, I look forward to sharing those discussions back with the advisory group and love to hear any questions or thoughts you have on that now.
So it sounds like there's no questions right now. One thing I wanted to point out is that Jennifer and Brian and Bob are all three going to present in these general program areas and are going to talk about the stakeholder sessions that they'll be holding over the next few weeks. And advisory committee members are not only welcome to participate in those sessions, they will be encouraged to participate in that process to the extent your time allows and to the extent your interest drives you there. At the same time, we understand that you probably won't have the capacity to participate in all of that work that's going to go on. So we fully intend to roll up what we learn at those sessions and bring it back to you at our meeting in July. So But we will be soliciting your interest in those sessions in the program that Jennifer just described and the other two programs that you're going to hear about. So if there's no questions on this presentation, then we'll move on to Brian and the program formerly known as RD&D.
All right, thank you all. Yeah, I will do very similar work that Jennifer just did and describe a little bit about what we used to call the RD&D program. Right now, we've got Clean Energy Innovation and Demonstration. That is something we came up with, but that would be one of the first things we could talk about is how we describe this program or name this program in a way that resonates with folks. But I'll talk a little bit about its development, where it came from, and what we've done with it to date. Next slide. This is one of our basic slides. You can go to the next one. This just describes kind of the different areas that we're looking at to cover with the Clean Energy Fund. So our research, development, and demonstration project program is one of the three programs that has been consistently funded in all 4 rounds of the Clean Energy Fund. So I will say maybe from the beginning, it's the one that is for kind of everybody. We don't have a lot of guidelines. I mean, there are guidelines put in by law, and it's obviously clean energy and clean technology focused, but otherwise we've kind of made it the catch-all. We haven't put a lot of specific boundaries around it. I will say I was an advocate of that in the beginning. I think there's some changes that need to be done, but part of that was to open it up so that we weren't deciding what were the right technologies. I mean, we had some really very strong tendencies to move toward obviously grid modernization in our electrical infrastructure. The bioenergy world and the bioproducts world is something we're very strong in. And the built environment is something that we're always very strong as a state. But we wanted to make sure that we had a place for folks with water technologies, folks with, as we'll talk about, we got into carbon fiber recycling. So it's been a very open pot of money. And the language that's actually in the law that applies, actually this first sentence applies to all the Clean Energy Fund, benefit to the public through development, demonstration, deployment of clean energy technologies that save energy and reduce energy costs, reduce harmful air emissions, or otherwise increase energy independence for the state. So that's really the only official guideline we have on what we're trying to do with the Clean Energy Fund. When you get into some of the language specific to RD&D, you get into this next sentence, which is where the amount of the scope that they did put on RD&D particular. I'm going to call it RD&D right now. I know it's the old way of saying it, but it's also much quicker. Research, development, and demonstration. So solar technologies, advanced bioenergy and biofuels, development of new earth abundant materials, lightweight materials, advanced energy storage, battery component recycling, and new renewable energy and energy efficiency technologies. Basically, especially that last couple words, we've had a very broad definition of that, a big tent thing. So as I'll talk about, we've got into a lot of the carbon recycling. We've kind of all over the board with it. Next slide. But I will say, and the purpose there, I want to stress the purpose of this fund was really to be that catch-all, but it was also that the innovation side of it, the earlier stage research, development, and demonstration. So, and I've got a slide to talk about that. But as we talk about this, I think in general, this program is how do we talk about and fund innovation in a way that actually moves the needle on some of these issues that we're dealing with in the state, but also somehow resonates with the people who fund this, which in the end are legislators, but also is something that the business community, the academic and research communities are interested in and can do something with, can make some real progress with. So that focus on innovation is something that I want to maintain throughout our discussion, and people who break off into the smaller breakout groups in this. I think we'll talk a lot about it. Again, I'm not going to read all this, but these are some of the real specifics around what we can give money to. And this is something, I don't know if we actually talked about it overall, but Clean Energy Fund has some big main goal guidelines that we're working with. And that is, it is from our capital budget. So that 15-year, well, it has to be a capital project. Right now, a 13-year lifespan is how the state defines that. But it's important to remember this comes out of our capital budget. I'm sure there will be some talk of what does it mean to go into the operating budget. I will say for these discussions, not that we couldn't talk about it, but there's a lot of reasons why that is very difficult. So really thinking about this, and the reason I bring this up, especially with RD&D, is I wouldn't, if you said make me a research and development pot of money to use, I wouldn't say it can only be used on capital expenses. It's not how RD&D is usually done. So that's one thing that makes this pot a little bit different. Even though it's research and development, it's still paying for capital assets and capital assets only. The other side, the other one that's everywhere is the one-to-one match. You'll see we've got better than one-to-one match, but everything has to have a minimum of one-to-one match. And then it has to be in this, the money has to be used in the state, and the entity has to be able to do business in the state. It is not a high hurdle to do business in the state. It's a pretty easy application to get a business license in the state. The money does have to be spent here. That's just to say that we have had partners from out of state come in, even out of the country come in to participate in projects and whatnot. As long as they can do business, they are eligible for the money. 36 months, we're trying to get these completed within 36 months of execution. So they've got a pretty long timeline that's not indefinite. And then energy technologies, which, and you can read that, but these are, again, all of this language are things that we have put around it to try to provide some guidelines and some boundary to the project. But all of this is negotiable, I guess I would say. Anything that's not written in the laws, so that first thing, the one-to-one match, the capital, it's coming out. The other is that's staying, that's going to be part of the Clean Energy Fund. But when you get into the projects must, some of those things we do in order to just make it feasible for us to get it done. We can talk more about that later. Next slide.
Brian,
Hi,
Tom,
Brian.
yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was just going to say, there's a question in the chat. Feel free to interrupt me if you want to read your own question. But could these funds be combined with Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance projects in Washington?
Yes, yep. There's no, I mean, it's eligible for, I should say eligibility is pretty much anybody. It's nonprofit institutions, for-profit institutions, research institutions. And we often have projects that have multiple partners. One thing we do require is that at least one of the partners shows a true background or experience in research and development, some ability. I will say a lot of these, we want to choose folks that not only have good ideas, but also have the ability to take government money, describe a project, take government money, execute that project close to the time period with the right partners that they've contracted for. I mean, it's very important in the end is that these are going to entities that can actually pull off what they're saying, because that's one of the things that will really hurt us in this overall, in the long term, is if it starts going to groups that just don't have the ability to pull off the project. So back to Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. Yes, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't. And if you had some specifics, we could talk about that too. But they'd definitely be eligible. We won't go into this much. Michael kind of talked about it, but I do think it's important to see some of the progression of the program changes, especially since we're very heavy on the academic side. When Clean Energy Fund first started in that CF1 round, this pot of funding was specifically geared towards matching funds, matching federal funds only. In fact, it was originally geared, all 6 million of it was going to go to a effort to get a center of excellence around composite manufacturing that Oak Ridge National Lab ended up winning. We were going down the road. We had a big team put together a big proposal. When that, unfortunately, we didn't win. When that happened, we were able to switch fairly quickly and get some of the projects that I'll mention later funded. But originally, this was going to go to one big academic project to land a big center of excellence in the state. That experience led us to spreading it out a little bit over a couple different projects. And that experience, I think, led to the legislature in the next one, in the next two, and next 3 rounds actually, put in the language around federal funds or other non-state funding sources. So this is something that opened up the floodgates to applications. I know we've received, for some, when we have $8 million of funding, we've received 64 applications requesting well over the $8 million that we had available. So because of this any non-state money, it means that you can take friends and family money from your grandma to match this. You can take federal match. You can find a big corporate partner that will write a letter and say that they will match. So there is, it opened it up to a lot of interesting opportunities. It also made it a bit more challenging for us to administer, and we'll talk about that later. And then you can see some of that language too. They did adjust kind of the programs, what they may include but not limited to. They've continued to leave that new renewable energy and energy efficiency technologies on the end, which allows us to go after a lot of different areas. And I will say, well, next slide, please. These are one of our old graphics. One thing Michael has done a great job of is bringing in real professionals to administer this and talk about this, because you used to see these graphics that people like me and others made up. Not our strong suit, but this does talk a little bit about what the Clean Energy Fund was focused on when we originated it. And you can see this research, development, demonstration, we spoke about everything. So this RD&D matching money was specific to really trying to get that early stage, trying to pull in the research aspect of it into the development and a bit of the demonstration. Smart Grid obviously was very much in the demonstration. And then that loans program that Jennifer talked about is where we've always gone and used to talk about how we get into the deployment side of things. You can see there's been some other programs in the Clean Energy Fund that we can talk about later. Some of the other aspects of the Clean Energy Fund outside of these three main areas. All right, next slide. So Jennifer had the same graphic. Thank you, Jennifer. I used yours. But we have been, the RD&D has been in all 4 rounds. We put just under $32 million into it. We've had very good leverage in the first 2 rounds. It looks like 1-to-1 on the last 2 because CEF3, they're still in contracting, so we don't know those numbers yet. And CEF4 has not been released yet. We can talk about that as well. But those first 2 rounds, we got nearly 4-to-1 match. And obviously match is important, and the more we can leverage our funds, the better. Okay, next slide. So current grantee portfolio, it is all over the board. And at the end, I've got all the awards we've given away. I tried to put them in some buckets to show kind of some of the focus areas that we've awarded in. Grid and energy storage continues to be an area. PNNL, in particular, a lot of their awards for the in the RD&D did directly relate to some of the grid monetization work. They helped demonstrate some of the ideas around what PNNL invented and called transactive energy. We used some of this money to have PNNL do use case scenario work with all the grid monetization projects. They provided a technical and economic use case analysis of those projects. SNOPUD did a project with BPA, also around grid modernization. Demand Energy, now Next Watts, also in the grid storage, getting into the building operations side of things. Spokane Eco in that same world, looking at using buildings as part of the grid and different aspects of how you can integrate the built environment into a grid modernization program or a smart grid. Another area that we're seeing a lot of interest, and we've given a good amount of awards, is around, I call materials or recycling. The Composite Recycling Technology Center out in Port Angeles has been very successful. They've actually won awards in 3 rounds already. They are learning how to do unique ways of taking carbon fiber and trying to recycle that carbon fiber. At Link Power is biodigesters. Ceronics is a clean, environmentally friendly cleaning solutions company. Impact Bioenergy makes small biogas generators. And Coromat is a biodegradable styrofoam company. So kind of material related, kind of recycling, again, somewhat all over the board. Hydrokinetic energy is another thing that we have a lot of research capability in the state. And so with that, we've gotten a lot of successful awards. The Pacific Marine Energy Center used to be called NEMREC, out of UW, Oregon State, and University of Anchorage Fairbanks consortium led out of UW. They've been successful winning some awards to produce kinetic energy testing devices for testing out in the real world and whatnot. APL, the Advanced Physics Lab at UW, also has some kinetic wave energy awards in this last round. Dresser-Rand, or owned by Siemens, has a wave generating laboratory out in Bellevue that they've won awards for. Oscilla Power is a local company that generates energy through the motion of the waves. So all of those, that's an area that we've given a lot of awards. Other notable awards, I'd say, Microsoft, McKinstry, and Cummins is doing some interesting fuel cell work on how fuel cells can power data centers down in South Seattle. Beta Hatch is an insect farming company out in Wenatchee that is growing insects for food, potentially human food eventually. And then we've had some interesting ones in this last round around composite and metal forming and shaping technologies, both out of UW and PNNL. They're interesting and different. Next slide. Okay, well, I bring all those up and I'll show you some other things at the end that show all of the different awards we've given, but that's just to say, I think a lot of what we need to do in thinking about the RD&D is how we can keep it open, keep it viable, for a viable source for interesting young companies to look at and think that they may have a chance of getting some support from the state to do their innovative work. But we have to somehow, I think, couch that in a way that can show that we are aligning it directly with some of the policy work. This pot of money has been challenging on 2 sides. A, the story around it. Whether or not you need a story for innovation funding, I don't know, but our legislators often do. And it's hard sometimes to tell a story when you've got a lot of very disparate investments or grants throughout what are very complicated subjects overall. I mean, recycling alone is too complicated to explain to a legislator, let alone recycling and grid modernization and advanced material science. So some way to focus this fund in a way that we can talk about it and it feels resonant to the stakeholders. The other side is it's been very hard for us to administer internally. You'll hear Bob Kirchmeier talk next, and a lot of you may know him, but he has real expertise in the world that he is in the grid modernization world. I mean, he can talk the talk. We can't hire experts in all the different areas that RD&D focuses, and we've done some work to try to get that expertise in, especially when doing the final scoring of the projects. But even that, we can't find that much disparate expertise to review each different thing, each different application and whatnot. So, and then it's just, also, we've just had so much demand for it. Like I said, when we've opened up rounds of $8 million, we have over 64 applications, and the administrative way that we tried to narrow that funnel wasn't adequate. We need to figure out a way to, we're probably going to continue to get a lot of applications. We'll need to find a way to narrow those, some way, a funnel that allows us to get down to applications that we have a manageable amount, that we can really do some good scoring and make some good decisions on which projects are worthwhile. Equity in this one is not something that I feel adequate to even, I don't have the language to talk about it, quite frankly. It's really hard for me. That's why I'm excited to have a lot of folks in the academic world here, because how you talk about equity when it relates, like the workforce development that Dan talked about and stuff, I can get, but when we're talking about RD&D type projects, I need help on the lens that we look at those through.
We do have a question, Brian, if this is a good time.
Yep.
So Tom asks, is grid modernization a separate funding program or part of the RDD program?
Yep. That is a separate, that's a separate program, and that's what Bob is going to talk in detail about next. RD&D has had some, as I talked about, some projects that are related to grid modernization and energy storage, but it's not specific to it. I will say the one thing that you'll find out too when Bob starts speaking, the real big difference there is that this is the fund that can go to anybody. The RD&D pot of money, you don't have to be a nonprofit lender. You don't have to be a utility like you do in the grid mod. You have to be a, you can be anything. You can be nonprofit, for-profit. So it's a very wide open compared to RD&D, or compared to grid modernization, I'm sorry. So yeah, I think I hit those last two already. Compelling story, and how do we effectively administer these kind of programs. I'm pretty much done. You can flip over to the next slide real quick. Okay. So CEF1 awards. This was the first round of awards we got with the money. As you can see, these are the ones we had to turn pretty quickly and find some good projects, because the one that we thought we were funding didn't go through. The next slide. So CEF2. And I will say some other areas in this that are interesting. Zunum Aero is an area that we're interested in, electric aviation. Zunum as a company did not go forward, but that's an area that we feel we'll probably see more interest in. Other ones, I mean, and that's, we could talk about these in specific. Some companies are still around, some aren't. Some have been very successful, some have pivoted to do new things. And then the next slide. And here's three. We don't, like I said, this is actually 2 pages of this. We don't have the numbers yet because we don't have the awards, so we don't know all the full numbers to them. But again, this time we got in situ, looking at hydrogen for powering drones. So just to give everybody an idea of how broad it has been. And I think that's all I have right now. So questions?
Alana, I guess we're hearing none.
Yeah, I don't see any raised hands, but feel free to chime in if you have something to ask.
So if not, we'll turn it over to Bob. And my caution at this point is we are a little bit behind schedule, Bob. So we're going to have a hard stop at no later than 3:30, depending on the questions you get during your presentation, because we need to leave time for conversation. So anyway, just a caution.
Okay. I was told earlier that some of my audio was fuzzy. Can folks hear me now?
It sounds good now, Bob.
Okay. Okay, so I have a handful of slides here that provide just the general overview, and let's get started. The next slide. This is one of our typical introductory slides. I think we've seen this before. Let's go to the next slide. This one, we saw this graphic before, and the text about transforming and modernizing the energy sector and opening new markets. It's a nice graphic, shows a nice picture of the different programs. Next slide. Okay, I'll talk first about CEF1, which started in 2013. It was called Smart Grid Grants to Utilities. The name was later changed to Grid Modernization to make it more current in the later bienniums. It was very specifically oriented to be exclusively oriented towards electric utilities, and specifically utilities that were retail sales in Washington State. And they were allowed to create consortiums or partners with various vendors and researchers, but the application had to come from one of those. I think there's 60 some odd utilities in Washington State. And they had to do one-to-one matching. So the $15 million would typically be leveraged one-to-one. We did have some cases where in the submittal process, some utilities made the case for having a higher leverage match. But in general, the program's been funded, typically one-to-one. And one of the things that has come up in here, and you'll probably hear it again more, is that has made it a bit of a barrier to some of the smaller utilities that didn't have as much flexibility and bandwidth to pursue these kind of applications or administer these kind of projects. So the hard criteria that was written in the proviso for this particular bucket of CEF funds was that the projects had to emphasize integrating intermittent renewables through energy storage and information technology. They had to be basically brought back to a dispatch control room in some way. In other words, they couldn't just operate autonomously somewhere out on the distribution or transmission grid. They had to be brought back and incorporated into utility operation centers. They were allowed to use thermal properties of buildings and our district energy systems to store energy. One thing we found was early on there wasn't a lot of interest by the utilities in pursuing that option. More recently, we did get some of those, and I'll talk about that later. And then the fourth one was to improve the reliability and reduce the cost of integrating intermittent or distributed energy. They were further tasked with forming an advisory panel, which we did in 2013. And interestingly enough, we have essentially used almost the exact same advisory panel all the way through CEF 1, 2, and 3. There's been very few substitutions, and that has actually worked out quite well. See, there's a question.
Yeah, I can read that to you, Bob. It's from Tom, who asks, would demand response projects between utilities and their business customers be allowed under these rules?
Yes, it is allowed. We have had some applications to do aspects of demand response. And I can talk about that a little bit more. But it has not been the primary emphasis or what most utilities have come forward with. And I do believe that's primarily because demand response has been pretty well demonstrated, and in many cases is further along with being ready for deployment at scale, as opposed to a lot of what the utilities that did apply for the grid modernization program. Most of those were to deploy technologies that were kind of in between the early stage development and early commercialization. And so next slide. I see there was a question there by Mel Clark.
Yes. Mel asks, was an urban-rural divide identified as an issue to be addressed in future grant cycles?
It wasn't specifically listed as urban renewal, urban rural divide. There was some language in the proviso for CEF2 that required Commerce to have a separate competition for smaller utilities. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into talking about CEF2, but we've had limited success with that. Let me talk first about the CEF1. So we put out early on in 2013, when I first was asked to come on and stand up this program, we put together an RFP. We put it out. We got comments back. The initial draft was focused more on, who could deliver a project in a timely manner and efficient manner. The pushback we got was that the criteria should be more focused on projects that were innovative and novel applications of new technology. And so the weighting was put a little heavier on things that were innovative and novel. And that reflected in the kind of applications we got, which were, at least on this first round of projects, they were all to deploy various forms of battery energy storage. Some of them were lithium ion based, like I talked about earlier. Some were vanadium redox flow based. We really only got 4 applications. When we ranked them by the experts panel, they were basically almost a 3-way tie between the Snohomish, Avista, and PSE. We found a way to be able to fund those 3 projects with the funds we had available. The 4th project was ranked quite a bit lower, and it did not get funded. That was actually a project from Energy Northwest that later, a different kind of version of it got funded a biennium later. I'll talk about that later, but essentially we ended up with 4 projects with 3 different utilities. 2 of those projects were with Snohomish and 1 each with Avista and PSE. The 2 projects at Snohomish, one was a lithium ion based, that was Mesa 1. Mesa 2 was a vanadium redox flow based technology deployment. These were all, for the time, fairly large, what was called grid scale battery energy storage, and considered to be fairly significant, particularly for our state. And one of the things we did here was we had P&L. We actually funded the use case analysis through the federal match program that Brian talked about earlier to do the analytics, and that allows us to bring some federal money into the program to be able to fund more of the work by the overall list of utilities. Those projects have all been implemented. Next slide, please. They're located in these locations in the state, 2 of them in Snohomish County, 1 up in Glacier, which is, I would definitely consider that to be rural. And another one was in Pullman in next to the Schweitzer Engineering Labs facility in Pullman. So they were in different parts of the state, some suburban areas, some urban areas, and the one in Glacier, that I don't know if you've been to Glacier before, but that's pretty much the end of the private property before you go into the national forest up by Mount Baker. And these were all just deploying energy storage and evaluating the different technical and economic performance and comparing how them against each other for where they were applied. Since then, 2 of those installations that were vanadium redox flow have been taken out of service. One of them has actually been removed, the one in Pullman, and are awaiting some resolution with some warranty replacements of the new generation of that technology. Next slide, please. So in 2015, they had another round of funding. This was a rather challenging period because it was right on the heels of what Michael talked about earlier with the ethics investigation that got cleared up. But the criteria was essentially the same for CEF2 as it was for CEF1, with the added emphasis on looking for technologies that could combine battery energy storage with distributed generation and be configured in such a way that it could provide resiliency type benefits. And interestingly enough, the 5 applications we got that were final applications in that process all featured some amount of combining utility scale or community solar with utility installed battery energy storage in a substation or just on a distribution system environment. And the emphasis was more on integrating directly solar with that about that is in this round we did have a separate competition for smaller utilities, so they wouldn't be competing in the same category as the larger utilities, and we had a real hard time getting very much interest from the smaller utilities. A couple of them came forward that wanted to basically leverage existing community solar but not really bring in much in the way of new assets. So, you know, to get it to meet all the match criteria process, there was a handful of them that did not advance into doing a final application. So we've had a bit of challenge with getting the program to be approachable to particularly the smaller rural co-ops and PUDs, and it's partly because of the funding mechanisms they have available, but also just the bandwidth of their technical staff to execute on these types of projects. Those projects you see there are all currently in full-on stages of deployment. Most of them, the solar has already been installed. The one at Energy Northwest, which is the largest of the solar, is currently under construction. All of those, the battery systems are currently being manufactured or have been manufactured and factory tested and will be showing up and being put on slabs and connected in this summer. So we will have all of these projects, we will be having dedication and then more detailed analytics of how they perform in real time in real world grid applications. That information that will all be coming forth this fall and into early 2021. So that should be timely for those that have interest in the benefits of these types of programs. Next slide. So this slide just shows a little bit more how they're distributed. We had one in the San Juans. We had one in, which is, for all practical purposes, that's pretty rural. It's on an island you can't get to except by airplane or boat. There's one in Seattle and on Capitol Hill at a community center. There's one in Richland that's not far from where the PNNL facilities are, but it's on the outskirts of Richland. And it's in pretty much a big open area that used to be used for training linemen on doing live line maintenance for transmission lines. There's one in Arlington, near the Arlington Airport, that combines a lot of different kinds of assets together. It's somewhat of a test lab or sandbox type facility of a lot of different technologies for learning. And then there's one in Spokane near the where the new WSU medical school campus is, and Eastern campus, and not far from where Gonzaga is. And they also all have some combination of solar with storage, and all of them except for the one in Richland are being designed to be fully operational as an islandable microgrid with black start capabilities. Next slide. Okay, we had a third round appropriated for grid modernization in 2017, I believe it was. The funding actually came in a little bit later because there was some delay in the capital funding that year. Anyway, it was 10.5 million of grant funds available. It had very similar criteria to the prior grid modernization programs. Essentially the same criteria. We used essentially the same process and evaluation matrix and experts panel to evaluate the proposals. We began that solicitation in July 2018. It's a two-phase process where we ask the utilities to provide concepts. We review those for compliance with the criteria. We provide feedback on things like eligible assets, having the adequate level of match, and feedback on the technologies that they were proposing to use and how it aligned with the intent of different types of technologies that could be used. And then everybody that submitted a phase 1 was allowed to then advance to a phase 2 application. We had 5 final submittals at the end of 2018. Obviously, several of the concepts people provided in phase 1 were boiled down to a smaller set of final submittals. In some cases, the phase 1 submittals, I think I had 4 concepts from PSE and 3 concepts from Seattle City Light. So, phase 1 utilities were allowed to provide multiple concepts, but for phase 2, they had to narrow it down and pick their best and final submittal, and that's what was advanced to the selection committee. The review and selection took place in early 2019. We then did announcements and went into project development earlier this year, and those projects will all be going into construction, procurement next year and into 2022. As you can see by the timelines here, these projects take from the time you develop the solicitation until you fully install the assets and evaluate it. It takes at least 3 or 4 years because of the nature of the process and where the technology is. Next slide. So some of my observations about CEF3 and how things have evolved is that we've seen a more diverse range of energy storage technologies being combined with distributed generation. We have most recently in CEF3, one of the utilities, Avista, had included some thermal energy storage for the first time in the program. It was also combined with some electrochemical energy storage. Several microgrids for resilience and transactive energy were featured in the CEF2 and 3 programs. We're starting to see fewer use cases. In other words, the utilities are not looking at such a wide range of possible applications, but they're starting to narrow down what they think is the best use of these technologies, and they're more focused on longer duration type energy storage technologies as opposed to extremely short applications like, say, frequency response. For CEF3, we had 4 submittals that met the criteria. 3 were advanced into contract. 2 of those contracts were recently signed, and I have a 3rd one I'm still trying to get through development into negotiation, which would be a second project for Opalco in the San Juan. Next slide. CEF4. About a year ago, when the legislature went through the budget process, the funding that resulted for the CEF4 program ended up being only $1.5 million. So the message there, whether it was intended or not, the message there is that they're defunding the program. $3 million of the funds that were from CEF3 remain uncommitted, and we may be able to somehow combine that into a new solicitation going forward. We had very similar project and applicant criteria to as was written into the provisos for the previous grid modernization programs for CEF1, CEF2, and CEF3. The CEF4 does have the additional requirements for incorporating low and moderate income and equity concerns that were discussed earlier. We're still, working through how do we incorporate that into the process. And program development is pending outcome of this committee's recommendations. And as we move forward with realignment of overall CEF with the CETA legislation that was passed last year. Next slide.
Hi, Bob. We have a question in the chat from Dan.
Okay.
He says, an observation from the read ahead document is that the second biggest program in total expenditures was directed projects outside the 3 specific programs. Are there insights in the directed category for program redesign?
By the way, that can be waiting till after Bob was done, but it made me think of it because he talked about the reduced amount in grid mod for the CEF4. So we can wait till after, but sorry.
That's a good question, and I'd like to engage in the discussion on that during the Q&A. So this is actually my last slide. I put in here some points that are reflected in some of the question or dialogue we've already drafted for having with our interim stakeholder group for the infrastructure category. So some of the things that we intended want to discuss with that group and provide feedback to this ECPAC group is, there are obviously some synergies between grid transformation and transportation electrification technologies. And in fact, that came up in several of the concepts, both during CEF2 and CEF3. And that was brought up by several of the utilities like Seattle City Light, PSC, Avista, and Snohomish. And what we typically told them at the time was transportation electrification is a separate category. There will be a separate, there is a separate bucket of money being created in CEF3, and there will be a separate solicitation, and that was discussed earlier, that actually the proposal on that came in Monday, and there's been quite a bit of interest in that. But the reality of it is, though, is that a lot of the same technologies that are used for the fixed assets or the charging infrastructure can be integrated with the rolling stock or the ferries or whatever transportation is used, and it can be controlled and operated in a way that has potential benefit to the grid and can also help provide the electrification function. So I think that's one area that's going to be an interesting topic of discussion. There are also incremental opportunities for new infrastructure upgrades and major capital investments, or using different combinations of storage and non-wire solutions to achieve still meeting load requirements and providing enhanced resilience in a manner that really wasn't possible with the legacy grid architecture. Improvements to where funds are directed in program structures. I think Brian spoke about that a little bit. There certainly are some room for making the overall CEF program to address program structure and improve it. Appropriations process changes. Michael Furze talked about that a little bit. Incorporating equity, environmental justice principles, as Jennifer discussed. Identifying priority communities for investments, such as certain rural communities where the income levels are lower, or tribal communities that have had a hard time accessing this program. Some of the other topics are working with DOE to complement and leverage federal initiatives, working with regulators such as the UTC, or in the case of consumer-owned utilities, their own regulatory boards, design program outcomes around emerging technologies and the direction they're trying to go with the Clean Energy Transformation Act. And then also just overall expansion of eligible participants in partnership roles. One of the things that folks have brought up with me is that we're from like a community, like might be a municipal or county government. They might be in a situation where their local serving utility is there's a rural co-op or something like that, and they're just not in a position to be, that utility is not in a position to really be pursuing this, but yet the local government is interested in it, and yet with the way the defined criteria is, even if they have some funding and they have some interest, they really don't have an eligible situation. So I think those are some of the good topics for discussion, and I hope to be able to provide some more meaningful feedback to this group in about a month, based on the meetings we're going to have with the infrastructure group.
Thanks, Kate.
Yeah,
It
thanks.
looks like Tom has a question. Sorry, Kate, you go first.
No, that's good. I think we should open it up. It's 3:30, and so yeah, let's open it up. Tom, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do.
Yep, you have the floor.
Okay. So let's say, looking at these projects on grid modernization, it seemed like a lot of these were batteries and microgrids. The batteries made sense. There are a couple varieties of them, and there's a lot of testing and interest. They're pretty expensive. It's maybe it makes a lot of sense to me. I'm curious about the microgrids. Those seem to have more resilience. I mean, pretty clear resilience value. I'm wondering about the clean energy value. Do you think and batteries in a microgrid than there is on the larger grid, or what's the clean energy promise there?
So I'll start by saying, you know, that the cost of distributed solar has come down by, I think it's around 80% in the last decade. The cost of the battery technologies that are being used has come down about 70% in the period of time since we started the Clean Energy Fund. So what we're seeing is originally you could only do 3 or 4 projects with $10 or $15 million, and if they were battery deployments. And as we moved through this program, we actually saw the cost of the battery systems, the actual bid prices come in quite a bit lower than what was in the budget from when they originally developed the concept for the project. And so that actually allowed the utility to consider spending more of their budget on the solar aspect of their project or on other aspects of the project. So, but the combination of what they are doing there is not really driven so much by the solar cost, because we actually did not fund the grid modernization program did not actually fund the purchase and install of the solar panels, because a lot of those programs were funded through other production tax incentives or other various other solar incentive programs, and that would have been in conflict with the match requirements for the state fund. So most of the funds have been going towards the procurement of the other assets, such as the battery energy storage and the inverters and the switchgear and the cost of installing it and testing it and evaluating it. So I don't think the batteries necessarily drive more solar because of the way the solar programs, the solar incentive programs are structured. But I do think there's quite a bit of interest in the concept of if you combine the optimal amount of storage in its performance characteristics with the solar and for what the available resource is, that you get a synergistic benefit there where you can do some things with the solar combined with the batteries that you couldn't do with just the solar, particularly this resiliency benefit. So it allows that combined assets to be configured so that in the event of a natural disaster, major storm, earthquake, whatever, they can separate and operate. In some cases, they're combined with a legacy type diesel generator. In some cases, they are not. But it would allow the operating utility to operate that operation center or that customer load for, depending what time of year it is, for potentially several weeks or possibly even indefinitely if they prioritize for their most critical load.
Yeah. Again, I see the resilience value of it, but 98%, 99% of the time this will be operating on the larger grid. And I was just wondering what I know microgrids are kind of a new interest to utilities, but it's the clean energy aspect of it that I was trying to understand. I understand the benefits of solar from batteries on the larger grid. It's just the combination on a microgrid. Why the microgrid? And I know utilities just want primarily want the resiliency.
Yeah, they're using the energy storage for multiple functions, such as, to meet the criteria as a generating utility or for voltage, improving voltage control. They're using it for a variety of different use cases, and that's 99.5% of the time. The resiliency is an attraction mostly to the user or the customer. And the defining the value of resiliency is kind of the wild, wild west right now. There's no clear consensus on that. Kind of like some other things like defining the value of social cost of carbon and things like that. It's still a developing area.
So Bob, I'm gonna open this up. I'm operating under facilitator's privilege here, but I really would like to open this up for group discussion. That you have now had us talking at you a lot, and I think if advisory committee members are comfortable our videos and just kind of have a conversation. And Dan, your question during Bob's presentation, I think is a good one, and it crosses all these programs and even goes beyond them, in fact, because of the nature of the question, which was, you know, looking at the way that these funds have been spent over the years. There is a whole chunk of them that go to what we call one-off projects every year, which is certainly a product of the budget appropriations process under which these programs are created. So I don't know if Brian, if you saw the question and you want to speak to it any more than that, but or anybody else.
I would just elaborate. Sort of my thinking on the question is that, you know, I don't know the balance between it's like horse trading, which is probably not my purview to have any contribution to, versus is there a category of thing that's being asked for that is not covered by the other programs? And it's, you look holistically at that 35 million of expenditure and you say, you know, we're missing a category that we should be opening up the opportunity for whomever's not getting it directed to be thinking about bigger or something. So that was kind of where I was thinking. The horse trading part, I don't know that I have much to contribute to in the committee, in the closed doors of the committee, but are there categories, chunks of expenditures that you're seeing people asking for and cultivating that would be valuable for us to talk about?
Brian, you need to unmute.
All right, then I will start. Yeah, I mean, and others can correct me at Commerce, I may be missing it. I don't see throughout the history of the, I call them ornaments that we've hung on the Clean Energy Fund tree, a whole lot of consistency. I will say a lot of them are surprises to us at the end. When it gets published, we say, oh, look, there's a new direct appropriation to somebody that some concept that we'd never even considered or thought. A lot of this, we don't have a lot of ability to maybe direct it. It's a legislator that's got some ability to get something in, puts in their project. I'm not traditionally all that. I've been pretty vocal about being concerned about it just becoming a place where people put in their pet projects. I haven't been too concerned about it until this last round, because before it's always been our main programs that we've talked about today, RD&D, Grid Mod, and nonprofit lenders, and then some other things on the around it, one I'll talk about specifically. The last round got me nervous because of what Bob talked about. What I would consider our most successful program, the RD&D program, or one of the most successful programs, all of a sudden gets a big hunk taken out of it for no discernible reason. Basically, they gave us, I think, 6.5 million and then took 4.4 million, gave it right to the Port of Seattle to electrify T5, Terminal 5. Not against electrifying Terminal 5, but it is not at all in the spirit of what we're trying to do with the Clean Energy Fund. So that was concerning to me. And that's when they start pulling out at these core pieces that have been part of it. The other one trend we do see, and since this is mainly an academic group, be interesting. Every round there has been a direct appropriation, a fairly large, around average about $8 million direct appropriation to a research university, specifically invest in that kind of sets the stage for clean energy research and whatnot. I personally like that. That'd be something that would probably make sense to codify because it happens every year. It has happened every 2 years anyways. So there is one right there, maybe a direct funded, a direct pot of money. And that's what the RD&D money was originally, specifically for universities to look at, to kind of provide the foundation of research around clean energy. Otherwise, no, there've been everything from, well, there's also been programs that just have not been successful. We had a program that was given about $6 million to incentivize clean energy manufacturing. We put it in a way that basically provided relief on the interest for a loan to do a project. So basically repaying, taking the interest paid off a loan to do a project. It wasn't bad. It was a little cumbersome. The problem with it was that it only lasts for 2 years. And manufacturing facilities don't just spring out of the ground. You need to permit them, you get all the paperwork together. So the one applicant that we did have that was very successful couldn't get the financing done in time before the biennium ended, and they reappropriated the money. So some programs just haven't worked, and they've taken them away. Other things just come and they're there for one session and then they're gone and they're a direct appropriation, and often they don't get used because we had one instance where it was directly appropriated, not named, but a very specific requirement to be given to a entity that really there was only one entity in the state that could meet all the parameters that was put on it. And then in the end, it wasn't that much money and that entity didn't really even want it, so they didn't go after it. So it's been all over the place, and it would be interesting to talk about how we get this so legislators see the value in keeping that core program. And then also, I'm not against the direct appropriations. It's nice to give legislators something to get a project that is important to them off the ground. But I don't want those two things overlapping necessarily.
But this was one of the things that we wanted to make sure this committee understood, was just because when you come at this project new, you assume there's some kind of a permanent structure around this program, but it really is a subject of every 2 years, a process some of which is transparent and some of which occurs behind closed doors. So that is one of the challenges we deal with. But as you heard this afternoon, there's a lot of good things that have come out of this.
This is Bob again. Did we adequately address Dan's question?
It feels like Dan's the one who could answer that.
Yeah.
Dan, you're muted. Well, while we're waiting for Dan to figure out how to unmute, that's what we're waiting to do.
No, can you hear me?
Oh, Dan, this is fast for you typically. This is really good. I'm proud of you.
Usually it's the host that is muting me, not myself. So
Okay.
Anyway, I learned more about the program. I don't know whether I got enough information to say. I heard maybe I heard two nuggets that could be actionable. One is that maybe there's a larger equipment thing that might be programmatically relevant. And the other element that I think I heard might be that that there's not a huge motivation for us to try to think of mechanisms to keep the to keep the backroom dealing out of this program, or to in some way I didn't hear a strong motivation that, boy, we really have got to be telling legislators what they lose by doing that 5 million out of the 6.2 million. I'm not sure I heard that we've got to really think hard about that. Although I would say for a program that had 64 applications all over the state that didn't get funded, that there should be a strong motivation for a lot of people to scream if 5 million out of 6.6 gets pulled out, and that means now 64, only 4 out of 64 get funded instead of 20% of them or something. But I'm not sure I heard that is really a problem.
So I need to clear something up. When Brian was talking about when he talked about they took 5 million out of a $6.2 million, he was actually referring to the grid mod program. And so we're kind of mixing things here, because the grid mod program has never seen 60 some odd applications. It's typically only seen about maybe a dozen or so applications expressing interest. And when it came down to final applications, we typically have only seen about a dozen applications.
This is Sarah. If I may just really quickly add something to this conversation. Kate, what you said I think is really important, that just, we're trying to think outside the box here, right? Like, we don't need to necessarily do business as normal, and we want to really think about what mechanisms are best for sort of each of these types, for each of the outcomes that we want to have, which may be really different for advancing clean energy, research, development, and deployment. Sorry, I don't know the new names yet. Research, development, and deployment versus grid mod. And, I think from an equity perspective, and what I hear a lot from external stakeholders is that, consistency is really important, but also like, knowing of a full project, if you're developing a project, that it could get funded. So, I just want to throw on the table, like, one of the ways that we could be thinking about sort of a different way to approach this work that has been talked about, that I've heard talked about from different folks at our agency. This is not my idea, but it's modeled on, coming up with feasible project lists that then you can kind of be moving down that list and then fully funding a project based on a bucket of money, as opposed to getting a bucket of money that then you kind of have to figure out how to divvy up. So, that there's some kind of process to get the queue going and do that in an equitable way across the state. Think about this rural-urban divide, have certain carve-outs, really address stuff. And then, so then it's like, oh, are we going to get the money or not? We don't know, but, we don't, when we do get the money, we're able to kind of say, like, here's a project ready to go. And I think, that's really in line about, I think on ARA, they talked about shovel-ready projects, but it's not quite that, right? But it is just the idea that you could have a slightly different mechanism. Brian, you might have stuff to say about this too, but, that might be work really well for grid mod, and it might not work for RD&D. So I just want to offer too that we could think differently about how to approach this, and it also might not be the same for all of the types of money and outcomes we're looking for.
Yeah, I would add to that, and I think Sarah's right, like looking outside the box, and this is something that, I mean, a lot of us at Commerce have been dealing with this for many years, and we have our preconceived notions about what it should or shouldn't be, but we do have ourselves in a box, and like it has to be competitively awarded. That's what the language in the law says. What competitively awarded means, we have different programs throughout the state that award things competitively that are not the process we use for Clean Energy Fund. So right now we've always had it where we have to have these projects, we get the funding, we have to do a big RFP project kind of based more on like a federal process maybe, and then we choose it. We choose based on the applications we get in that time frame. We often have that 2-year window of the capital budget, so we feel like we have to get everything appropriate and out in those 2 years. But there's nothing to say that we couldn't have a list of projects ready to go that somehow had a competitive, they got on the list through a competitive nature, and that's our competitive process. And then once we have the funding, we know these are the projects that we're going to support. I mean, there's many different things. And I would just say, think outside the box. Commerce, we as Commerce have put ourselves in a lot of boxes that it's probably hard for us to see outside of. So that's why your views on this.
Yeah, and Dan, to your point, about this backdoor dealing, it's really about telling a good story to the legislators too. And so what's the clearest story we can tell about our impact and the outcomes we're trying to get to?
So Angela, I think you had something to say and we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, so in terms of thinking outside the box, and I think this relates a little bit to what Sarah was just saying. I mean, I can think of other examples where there are these lists of projects that when funds become available, there's a queue, like the Land and Water Conservation Fund, for example, comes to mind, right? Where there's a federal side of the program, there's a state side of the program, there's a state board that sort of, racks and stacks, and some of the prioritization is based on how much like the local entity ponies up in the deal, just in terms of thinking about other models for it. But as I sit here today and like everything going on in the world, sort of from an economic perspective, I also think, should we think a little bit about a couple of the two major drivers in my mind, which, for Washington State, we have the CETA compliance out there for all of our utilities. And what's that going to take? And obviously there's a regulatory process, et cetera. But, sort of public support for that kind of effort ultimately, eventually will hinge on costs and benefits and things like that. But then the other factor I think would be interesting to think about in this context is who knows whether or not federal stimulus actually shows up again. But in the event that it does, how do we best position Washington State entities to capture large chunk, well, more than their fair share of available potential stimulus, particularly in the sort of technologies or sectors that are going to be key to meeting sort of the goals of the state energy strategy. As if I go back in time and remember the good old days of the Recovery Act, often cost share was a significant factor in what won and what lost. So just a couple things to think about in the context of current goings on in the world and the sort of political and economic reality of the next legislative session. I'll just throw that out there and interested in people's thoughts.
Well, and one thing I'll kind of add on to that is we are in this intense process of developing the 2021 state energy strategy, and there's a lot of technical work going into that and analysis and process, but also some really good outcomes that are going to come. So, and they're very interested as a group, the advisory committee for that process, as well as the technical consultants, in seeing what the outcome of the process we're going through here, because they're not doing the same thing we're doing with the CEF in particular, and kind of this idea of funding projects and having them and thinking about economic development as we do it. So this work will feed well into that process as well.
I see a couple of people have their hands up. Also, Joel made another comment. So just going in order, Michael, you were first, and then Tom.
So my question was, and I'm sorry if I missed this early on, but have the goals of the programs changed? We talked about how different parts of the program have changed and how money has moved out of here and moved into there, and the requirements of RD&D has changed and this and that sort of thing. But are there a firm set of goals, and have they changed throughout the program? Because if we're going to assess the success of the program and how we might do it better, then having a firm handle on goals and how they've been transitioning would be an important piece.
Goals is an interesting. legislatively, the wording has stayed the same. It's that very basic sentence that I said, and that's the only thing that's legislatively ever been provided as far as goals. I think most of the conversation internally at Commerce and with a lot of you have been, we've done this backwards. We've had the Clean Energy Fund now for 8 years with no policy for which to focus it. Where in a perfect world, you would have wanted a policy and then put something like the Clean Energy Fund in place to start driving towards those policy goals. So in a way, I think we do now have, whatever our goals were or weren't in the past, I think we do now have a goal in that we have to meet some pretty substantial legislative policy requirements now. So that's what these groups need to focus on, is how do we take this and aim our goals directly at being in alignment with CETA, but clean buildings. I know clean buildings is the next question. And I think I put a question on mine. There are policies out there that we know we want that we don't have yet, but we know we need them to get to some certain climate things. Clean fuel standard would be a good example. Should we also be considering those things, shooting for goals that we know we need to address to meet our large climate goals that might not have the policy behind them yet?
Because it seems as though, sort of really looking at what those metrics are, and had programs in here helped you move to that metrics, right? So it has the grid modernization piece allowed us to move more renewables onto the grid, and how much so, and what has that done from a carbon impact, or so on and so forth. Job creation's been a past thing, and RD&D focused on small companies has that sort of driven that. Is research capacity and infrastructure, is that an issue, and have we been able to drive that forward? And then it seems as though if we can understand what those goals are and how we can structure the programs around that, then some of the suggestions, like Angela gave in terms of, can we then multiply the X amount by positioning ourselves to be very competitive in a federal landscape via this program, whether it's a new stimulus or whether it's just existing research programs or deployment things and stuff, then that can be an added strategy to this to make us more competitive.
Somebody may be typing without their.
Okay, Tom, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I think a lot of this is good discussion, especially trying to leverage potential future federal funds. I was thinking a little bit about what we can learn from what the council does. Really good regional planning going on, and one of the findings there is that a major limiting factor on clean energy in the Northwest is the ability to integrate the wind and solar into the system. As somebody mentioned, solar costs have gone way down, wind costs have gone way down. That's not really the problem right now. The problem is integrating it into the system. So, the focus on batteries, that makes sense. That would, that's part come down fast enough. That would really usher in a real flood of carbon-free power. But the leading technology strategy that the council identified was demand response. And they consistently said it appears that it's cost effective. It's used in other parts of the country. It's not in the Northwest. And for whatever reason, it's not here. And we need as much of it as in other parts of the country. So I'm just wondering, Bob said, well, there's not a lot of interesting, technology questions there, but maybe there are. We have a new law requiring demand response compatible hot water heaters in the state of Washington. That kicks into effect pretty soon. But there's potential for the technology of connecting those hot water heaters and utilizing that demand response and to their utilities and make this viable. there's all sorts of problems and barriers. They may not be technology oriented, but there's barriers because we don't have it now. And again, I think if there's any way the Clean Energy Fund can help in that respect, that might break, it's a bad metaphor, but break the dam to bring a whole lot of solar into this, solar and wind into the Northwest. Thanks.
Yeah, this is Bob. I'd like to further comment on demand response. Because I've been involved in some of that during my time at Snohomish, and yes, it's true. It's been deployed quite a bit in other parts of the country. It's a technology that, as long as you put in the other necessary communications infrastructure and be able to bring the signals for control and monitoring back to a head-end facility, there's been lots of progress with demonstrating that. It's a technology that is basically could be deployed at scale if it's consistent with policy. There isn't a whole lot of new invention or technology innovation required there. It's new to a lot of our utilities in Washington State because they haven't been encouraged through incentives to do it a lot, but that would certainly could be an outcome of some of these recommendations, is that we have some amount of emphasis on helping utilities move forward in that area and deploy it at some increasing scale.
Yeah, and I comment on that too, because it's interesting, the idea of, like, we talk about innovation and what does that mean? We want to stay innovative. Some of that is, maybe it is commercialized all over the US, but maybe we should focus on what's innovative for our state. Maybe implementing big demand response in our state would be innovative because we've got barriers that we haven't been able to overcome like other states have. The other thing that makes me think of demand response, that I think about with demand response, that is actually a big problem within Clean Energy Fund that we haven't discussed, because it is I think of demand response as having a lot of software involved. Because it is a capital funded project, our state so far has not allowed us to do any funding of research of software R&D, which is a shame in our state, obviously, because we have so much expertise. But thus far, it has been determined that that is not a capital expense the way we look at it. So that may be another barrier to demand response type work.
So we have more questions. We have more folks who want to engage in this conversation. I'm just conscious of the fact that we're close to at end of time. Before we start losing people, and again, everybody's welcome to stay on. Brian is hosting and buying. He can handle however the happy hour goes. But I just, before we start losing people, the schedule and kind of plan that we have put together for the work of this committee is reflected in the schedule that's up on the screen, which would be these kind of deeper dives into these respective program areas, but the program areas with boundaries kind of larger than they are right now, and to bring together stakeholders at the table and just kind of brainstorm, just like is happening here, ideas for how you can recommend these funds be invested by the legislature in a manner that adjusts to our current economic and climate, our economic situation and our climate goals. So, does this proposal that we've made sound okay to people? Does having another meeting in July to come back after these stakeholder sessions are conducted and kind of talk about the outcome of that? It's very clear we need more time for open discussion. we cut that too short today, and I apologize for that. So before we respond to the exact questions that are on the chat or in any of your minds substantively, does anybody have any thoughts they want to share about the proposed schedule that we've put forward and amendments that they want to suggest to that? Well, I think that's good. All right, and one thing is I've never been confident that we can do this in 3 meetings of the advisory committee, but I didn't want to scare people off. So we'll see how that schedule goes. It may be that we have to fit in one more meeting of this group, particularly to allow this kind of more brainstorming. With that, if folks can stay on, I think we've lost Angela, but it sounds like she's going to check back in a bit. Brian, there's still some questions on the table in the chat that Lana can read, or I don't know how you want to handle this now that we're moving into your social hour.
And yeah, and thank you. I literally stuck this on because I'm happy to sit around and continue to discuss. And I know, especially for a lot of you that may not have been involved with Clean Energy Fund, probably have a lot of questions. So I'm available. I will offer to let you go up and get yourself a drink. I can't provide one, but and also if you have to leave, just please drop off. Thank you for coming, and we will obviously be in touch. So with that, yeah, Alana, I mean, I can see all the questions and people can pipe up, so I don't think you really have to do much. So I just open it up.
Joel did ask a question a while back. If Joel is still around on the call and wants to talk about that.
Yeah, if you've got a list of the ones we haven't answered, you can go through them all.
Just chiming in on a question that was already asked about potential for project activity supporting compliance with CETA. And I just chimed in, yeah, CETA, but also the recent legislation adding existing buildings and to the energy efficiency standards, and therefore the need for probably some pretty innovative approaches to large building retrofits. I'm thinking of some of the technologies and methods used in Holland and other places in Northern Europe that is an approach that we might be needing in this region and would be driven by that legislation taking effect.
Yeah, I personally expect that we'll see a lot. I mean, we've gotten, as many of you know, an amazing kind of built environment work in our state around everything from the architecture to the design and architecture and the construction and the operation of buildings. And we do have a lot of interest, a lot of our big HVAC companies and whatnot, or mechanical engineering companies that have ideas. And, you know, it's getting them over. I mean, a lot that we have in those 60 some odd applications, there were some around building technologies. We haven't had as many successful, but yeah, I agree. I think we'll see a lot more. And that's that's a real clear policy goal that we can easily align to. I mean, it's there, it's on the books, and it's pretty straightforward.
And it's not a mass market thing. I mean, it's buildings above a specific size and a pretty large size initially. So, you know, you kind of know who the usual suspects are. And the same thing with the vendors, like, you know, it's all the people we've got on our advisory board, for example, that are probably interested in playing in that space. And I'm wondering if, for example, our own buildings might be a guinea pig as a opportunity to you know, jumpstart that, maybe involve students, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one, and we'll definitely talk about it in the RD&D or subgroup on what those opportunities around, or how we can align it with those specific bills. CETA's one, and then clean buildings is the other one that we need to get some focus on. You know, I'll also bring up another thing Angela kind of mentioned, and other folks, I think, as we look at stimulus money coming, kind of gets to what Joel, I'll do a hypothetical. You got RD&D. Say they give us $10 million for RD&D. There's two thoughts. Do you take 4 $2.5 million awards, say we have a federal stimulus award, and find some big projects that can leverage? We can get 4 federally financed. With that 2.5 million, we could get 4 $10 million federal projects or something. That's the camp that I come out of and think is probably the way to use that kind of money. But there's a lot of folks also in commerce that make very good arguments of why the RD&D fund should maybe be a whole lot of $100,000 awards spread out amongst small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and maybe large, all across the state, to really bring more people in versus 4 large projects that maybe are more involved, have more kind of known large companies, large university research institutions in them. And that's an area that we should probably need to discuss. I personally think we have it gets really hard to administer lots of small awards, but also maybe that's just the framework for which we use to administer them. I know Angela brought up that another state program that people are looking at as a potential, as another way to look at the Clean Energy Fund. And maybe there's a mechanism within those ways to help us fund smaller projects without taking on the administrative burden of administering that many projects.
Yeah, so I mean, I have an opinion on that, and I think it should. I'm always a person that is an and person. I don't ever use the operator or. So I think it should have some elements of both of those things, honestly. I mean, because unfortunately, I see both sides of that. I mean, bigger projects probably have higher capacity for leverage, more potential for implementing organizations that you can show the delta from. But small projects, new ideas come in, they're spread around. And so I don't know that I would take 10 million and break it into 4, but I may take 10 million, break it into 2 $5 million pots and administer one pot as seed that gets sprinkled, and one pot that is larger programs that are on a timeline that can be aligned with a couple of federal opportunities or something.
Without dismissing all of those concerns, I'm thinking of it from a slightly different perspective. In terms of an ecosystem, more or less, think about the microgrid discussion. You also need battery systems. Demand response can fit in there. You need the software. There's all these different elements, or even just going from, as Brian mentioned very early on, somebody did, going from research and development to proof of concept to actually manufacturing at scale. We've got all these gaps along the way. And strategically, there's an argument for thinking in that term and focusing in on complementary technologies for a brief while and getting them off the ground and then shifting to something else.
Yeah. There's lots of ways to think about it, and we'll figure out the right way. I mean, I think this is a good point for those that are on. We didn't talk about it too much, but we do have the 3 stakeholder groups that we're looking to fill. As Kate mentioned, you're welcome to join any of them or all of them. I would also put out a request. We've got some other stakeholders that we're building those groups with, but if anybody on the call knows somebody that really should be part of one of those groups, let us know that as well, because we want to get the right voices on there.
And I think Alana and I will be working on some kind of message to the advisory committee members about how that will work, and soliciting that kind of information and your degree of interest and that kind of thing.
One of the questions that is maybe slightly related to Tom and Bob's conversation around demand response is we've mostly talked about vehicle electrification, mostly from the perspective of light duty vehicles, I think is what I've seen. And, you know, Metro has a problem with their 500 kilowatt hour bus batteries. They've had a pilot program. They just bought 40 more buses, and how a scheduled service fits with the grid, the scheduled service, without having huge demand responses. Bob, I don't know whether you've seen this challenge. It's going to be true of ferries where they've got large batteries that they're going to be plugging into the port's grid. It's associated with metros, buses, large batteries, and it would be true of heavy duty vehicles like PACCAR and Freightliner and others are working on. The big batteries are much more problematic for collaboration between transportation and the grid than the distributed small batteries. Any comment on that and how that might fit with any of the programs we've been talking about here?
Bob, you're on mute.
Yeah, I was hoping Bob was going to speak up. I've had much discussion with some of the utilities I've worked with over the years about this topic. And I think I mentioned it earlier, during part of this process for concepts coming forward, several of the utilities brought this issue up. And unfortunately, what I ended up having to tell them is that you know, that particular combination of technologies was not aligned with the parameters of the grid program, and it would more suitably fit into the transportation electrification program, which has been a little bit later in being, you know, the solicitation coming out, and we're just now seeing the results of that. But I think where this will likely go is that we should not have so many these different programs be so siloed or stovepiped, and they should not have as many prescriptive requirements, and leave up the combining of different technologies and partnerships to the creativity of the consortiums that want to come forward.
And some of those sideboards, and I think the read ahead paper had it in it, but some of those sideboards are the construct of the budget appropriations that we've gotten, but there are also, some of them are the construct of just the way the program's been interpreted and applied, and just the way Commerce has managed it, and so aren't necessarily fast constructs that we have to operate with. So that's one of the fun things we can do is think about.
Yeah. For example, I can think of right now at least 3 or 4 instances where the utility was working with some NGO or municipal organization that wanted to combine some of these different technologies, and what happened is it didn't quite fit, and in some cases, like this latest project we just signed with PSE for Tenino, you know, they had to kind of split their application, part of it towards the grid mod, which got selected and funded, but the other part of it, they had to try and fit it into the RD&D program, and it didn't advance. So, you know, and there's a couple similar cases to like the ones I talked about with Seattle and Snohomish, and even with Tacoma, that they kind of have that profile. And so I think there's some improvements here that we're going to end up you know, talking about that would make the program more accessible for a wider range of combinations of technologies and assets.
I've got lots of issues I could bring up with the group, but I will not talk because I always talk, and keep it open for other folks, especially folks who have questions about the Clean Energy Fund or what's happened in the past or anything. We're happy to answer.
Or waiting for people to chime in. I'm gonna have to drop off here in a few minutes. I have another meeting to go. It's been interesting, definitely. And Kate, I think it will be interesting to see if we can handle this with just more meeting, or we're gonna need a meeting to bat that around and a meeting to draft the kind of reports you're looking for in terms of that. So.
Well, yeah, thanks for participating, Mike.
And we do have 2 meetings on the books. We have one in July to kind of consider what comes out of the stakeholder sessions, and then one at the end of the summer to finalize whatever, to talk about what we want to report out.
Maybe we are okay then.
If you want more meetings, Mike, we'll give you more meetings. It's not a problem.
I'm Zoom slammed lately.
We did this on WebEx for you, so you don't have to.
Oh, thank you so much. It made it so much better. Well, it's been great spending time with you. This has been the favorite Zoom meeting or WebEx meeting I've had all week. So, okay. See everyone. Yeah. Bye-bye.
I will bring up one thing, since I do have a few, especially one challenge we've had, Bob addressed it a bit, is especially in grid modernization, how do you get the smaller utilities involved in these programs, help them get the capacity? I think for a lot of the universities, Central, Western, whatnot, obviously these programs have been much more geared towards and PNNL, UW and whatnot, and WSU with their research capabilities. So thinking of ways that we could make it way that your universities can better participate in these things. And maybe it's by making it easier to partner with the research universities, traditional research universities, or maybe it's figuring out some aspects that would be that would speak more to the programs within your universities or to the students within your university. So that's another kind of large, I think that goes for all of them, grid mod with the utilities, but probably RD&D, how can we get some of the more universities involved than we have in the past? And since nobody's talking, I'm going to bring up another thing that I think about. I guess getting really more towards RD&D, it kind of gets into grid modernization. But if we want a pot of money that really helps businesses that may be growing in our state, we can't really decide what problem we want them to be working on. So obviously we have to align with CETA and whatnot, but do we need to provide space for companies that are doing really, I mean, there's tons of recycling work going on in their state, issues going on in our state that have climate impacts. Do we open it? And also, if you're just looking at problems within our state, no company's going to make a business off of solving problems for the 7.5 million people of Washington state. They've got to look at it on a much larger scale. And we want to do that. We want to help companies grow here that are going to be selling their solutions to the entire world. So although I know we have to align more with policy, I do wonder how we keep it open. We have so little support for companies in this state. It's just hard for our state to give away money. I think most of you know that, but our state has a unique constitutional restriction that makes it even harder for us to give money to for-profit, privately owned groups. So we don't have a lot of direct support for like small businesses and whatnot. Clean Energy Fund has been a place where we have been able to support some of those companies, and yeah, finding that balance between supporting those small companies versus aligning it better with our policies. And I will say, A lot of this is the stories that resonate with legislators that fund these things. And you'd think, given a lot of little money out to a lot of companies might be interesting to them. It doesn't seem to be as interesting. They often like to hear about big projects that they can go look and feel and touch. And they all want it in their district. So.
One question I have for this committee is, would it be helpful if we did a more deeper dive on some of the projects that have already been implemented or are well underway?
How many RD&D projects have been funded? Because I know a lot of them, both on RD&D and grid mod. I've been paying attention. I'm just curious, how many of the RD&D things have been actually funded over the years? Brian is muted. I see your mouth.
No, I'm just counting them. I have them on my slides. I don't actually know the number.
So that one of your slides had all of them? Got it.
"28 officially, 28 projects. A few of those that are on here didn't go to completion. They weren't able to spend all the money or went out of business. But in general, about 28 been given out.
You know, I mean, I happen to be a super big fan of the small company money, but I know that those guys, they're the least stable of your potential folks on the spectrum of risk. Small startups where it's an SBIR that's being matched by the RD&D that's a high risk dollar. And I know that when the companies fold, it creates trouble for Hans and other people to figure out what do we do with this 13-year capital asset when this organization is gone, and Commerce is not in the business of trading and managing research assets or whatever these companies have generated. So so that kind of detail, Bob, to me, where have been the problematic points in the way we've been doing it now, where we've given to some companies, they buy a long-lived capital asset, but they're not a long-lived organization. How do we manage some of those things? I think that would be an example that, just because I've been paying attention to this program and see some of those companies at the test beds and other things, understanding, I think for the broader committee, understanding some of the complexities of what it means when I hear Commerce saying it's hard for us to manage these things, that I think would help a lot of people to understand some of those details, like long-lived capital assets, short-lived companies.
Yeah, Bob and Hans, feel free to speak up too, because you two deal with that on the daily.
I would just say there's a handful of projects that we have right now that are fairly far along, that are coming to fruition, in the next, I'd say 3 or 4 months, which kind of fits the timeline of this group, that it might be beneficial if I shared a video or a PowerPoint presentation, by the champion of the project, and you could get a better feel of what all's involved in that project, not only the assets, but what it took to put it together and execute it. If there's interest, we want to take the time to do that.
I think your program's having watched the process from behind the scenes on the Energy Northwest project.
Yeah.
Wow. I only saw a smidge of what they had to go through between getting the PPA, the offtake agreements, all this stuff. It was kind of painful to watch, and you know, from my perspective. There's a lot of stuff that goes into one of your projects, Bob.
Yeah, you know, I guess the comment I have or perspective I have on that is, I've been doing large complex infrastructure projects for a long time that are even larger than these. And so, you know, but to the casual observer, there's a whole lot more goes into putting these together than most people realize. And it's kind of hard to convey that sometimes.
I would say in some way that is part of the story, that these organizations are willing to work this hard to make it happen shows the value in some way. So if people don't understand how hard it is to put together a project like this, they can't appreciate the level of buy-in you're getting from some of the organizations that are actually doing it. And it's probably hard for them to appreciate, why aren't the small guys? Why don't they have the bandwidth to do this? We're offering them $1 million. So it might be worth it because it, you know, it shows off the complexity of the program.
So, you know, one perspective is, I mentioned it earlier, we had an effort to try and attract the smaller utilities a few years ago, and we only got one. And what utility into contract and then getting them, you know, launched and
We're losing you, Bob, just so you know.
Yeah, Bob's off. Looks like Joel has to leave. By Joel. And my computer's telling me I'm about to die. And Scott's got to leave, so it's Mel. It's Mel and Dan.
And I can't believe it. I don't have a drink with me yet. I'm trying to hold out till 5.
Oh,
that's
why?
Very.
Are we still recording?
Yes, we are. You know,
That's unfortunate.
I'll just offer one thing on the RD&D space real quick. You know, it's a bit of a conundrum, obviously, in terms of obviously the 13-year lifespan versus companies that may never make it to that time frame. But I think less about what challenges that might bring versus like what risk are we taking versus what are we getting out of it. And to me, I think that just goes back to our conversation about appetite for risk and frankly being able to tell the story about, I would call it, quote, good failure, and making sure that we can tell that story correctly and it resonates with legislators.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think, and this is something Scott, I think, had put into his things, and Mel, I'm sorry if you were just about to jump in, I'll make it short. I think the idea of ecosystem or some framework that every project is described within. What is the human resource outcome from it? What is the technological or R&D outcome? What is the, you know, a set of 4 or 5 things so that when the technological outcome is bad, there had been a Western kid was in the project for Opalco or whatever and got an internship. You have some of the dimensions of building the ecosystem, multiple of them in every project, a small company, big company, small utility, big utility, that you can say that one aspect of it may not have succeeded, but you know, there were other elements of building out the ecosystem. There's a kid that understands, that's graduating in EE or something, that understands now a solar storage project in a way they wouldn't have because they did this. They're going to contribute to the state of Washington. You know, so I really do think that having an overarching framework, and this is kind of, Scott was talking about the ecosystem, Mike was talking about the grand goals of this program. If you're scoring them in ways that you have multiple wins possible, you then always have a story about a win. Sorry, Mel.
Oh, I didn't have a specific comment that I remember now, but that made me think of another in this current climate. I think one of those pieces of that framework you're talking about is it created a job in this moment. And that's a win for rebooting an economy, that any projects that are selected, no matter their final outcome, is going to create a benefit towards economic stimulus.
Yeah, the jobs conversation is going to get so important, and it's another thing I struggle with RD&D. Like, you don't do research and development with an outlook on creating jobs. Maybe way far down the line, but not on the scale or at the time frame that we're dealing with. But yeah, we're going to have to tell that job story, obviously, in a way we haven't before. The other thing we didn't talk about so much, Kate was mentioning it, this comes every 2 years. We put in very similar requests, but we never know what's going to come out the other end. I would say this session is the one that's even more wide open, because who knows? I mean, the governor is still going to go after a clean energy fund. But what that's going to look like from a request standpoint, and then what legislature is going to come back with, is going to be very interesting as well. And that's another reason to think outside the box, because we may have a very different box after this next round.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead. Pardon me.
Oh no, I apologize for jumping. For a thing for this year too is, obviously we haven't rolled out CEF for RD&D yet. Just around for multiple reasons, but one of those certainly reasons is capacity, and with the hiring freeze, which also is probably another consideration for the design, the way that we take a look at this program moving forward.
I was going to say on the job front that we shouldn't forget our R&D at least in the Puget Sound area, is one of the biggest employers in the state. When you take Fred Hutch, UW, all of our academic student employees are 0.5 in the STEM fields, are 0.5 FTE employees, so most of those 50,000 people or whatever that show up as employees are funded by R&D grants. They're half-time students or whatnot. And so R&D is a big employer in our area, and I mean, we can list all the children's research. We can list all the research organizations. Microsoft Research is actually the biggest research organization in the state, as a $3.6 billion a year organization all on its own. So there is a job story in research for our area for sure. And of course, PNNL is all of those research. Those are all research jobs when they are working at PNNL.
Oh, we got Angela back, huh? All right.
That's why I had to mention PNNL. So
Don't forget us,
in a good way. While you were gone, Angela, it was all evil and vile and
exactly. Yes, exactly as I expected. Mm-hmm. I had to, retreat to the upside down for a few moments, but now I'm back.
Angela, do you live in Seattle or are you in Richmond?
Seattle. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yes, sir. One comment I made before I had to jump, and I'm just curious in your perspective, Brian, on this, is the manufacturing question. And I asked that. So Michael and Dan were part of that Energy Storage Grand Challenge workshop we had, and you heard from the DOE spiel. They're like, everybody is acutely aware that at one point in time we owned the IP around lithium ion, and we do not own any of the supply chain today. And how will we do things differently? And if you think back to the Recovery Act, they spent $2 billion on battery manufacturing, which appears to have done practically zilch to actually move the needle on the domestic supply chain. So I expect that there will be sort of bipartisan interest in exploring that topic. And there are a lot of other non-R&D related challenges and opportunities for Washington State in getting to a place where we are a competitive, place to locate a battery, like a next generation battery manufacturing facility. I just didn't know, Brian, what your thoughts are on that. I know you've been a party to a couple conversations wearing your commerce-y economic development hat, and I just see like, Department of Energy interest in going that direction. And I just don't know if there's some advanced thinking we can do to make Washington, whether it's central or eastern or northwestern or wherever, a competitive in that.
Yeah. Well, now you're talking my day job, and there are, so maybe in another conversation, because I probably need to talk to you about some of those things. Yeah, we are. I mean, that's one thing internally we're looking at is like we have an SRF program, a strategic reserve fund, which is the small amount of money we have to give to companies that we're trying to attract in. Is there ways to make a clean energy fund, some portion of clean energy fund, look more like that? A SRF, which it's basically to attract large scale manufacturing and whatnot. So those are some things we're thinking about. So yes, the problem we've had this whole time when you try to line up clean energy fund as it's traditionally been with economic development is economic development comes when it comes. And if we
It's
say,
much more opportunistic.
Yeah, if we say, you just have to wait for our RFP to come out in June and then we'll award 3 months later and you get a contract in. There are ways to work around that, but the way it's traditionally been implemented, it has been tough for us to line up economic development opportunities with it. But yeah, and especially as, there's a whole lot of conversations, especially as potential large stimulus funding comes for these opportunities that we're already working on. We do need to keep that very much in mind. I mean, we just lost our big, you guys might not see, but we just lost a very, very large semiconductor facility to Arizona. And we suspect actually that was possibly some federal meddling. Arizona is an important state these days politically. But though that was a huge bummer, but we've got about 3 more of those kind of game-changing opportunities that we're cusping on, but hard to get over. It's hard to get over that hump anyways to try to get that kind of stuff built in the United States. And with the limited amount of tools and stuff, we've got to figure out how we can keep. We're very attractive in certain parts of the states just for reasons out of our control, but we do need that final thing to land them and get them here. So if there's ways the Clean Energy Fund can be used to do that, we need to think about that harder. Now it's everybody. Yeah, we've lost everybody that doesn't know. Mel, you might find, but I mean, the other thing about this Clean Energy Fund is the only pot of money in our state that companies can go after to get grants. I mean, almost one of the few. And so, I mean, I'm always having to talk to aerospace related interests that are looking to get a little money to land a project, and they're trying to squeeze it in to make it a clean tech thing to qualify. And I feel for them because it really doesn't qualify, so we probably can't allow it. But like, it just speaks to how much need we have in this state all across, not just clean energy, to kind of put us over. Getting a little bit of share of state skin in the game can put us over the hump in a lot of these different projects. And so it gets frustrating when we're the only pot of money anybody can look to. So you got to say no to a lot, because we already said no to enough clean energy related ones, let alone other ones that really don't count.
And is there a way to be better coordinated or partner in some way with the JC Dream as a joint center that's got PNNL, UW, Wazoo, and others, and an industry component of matching for that, although none of the money goes to the industry people. Likewise, JCOTI, the Joint Center for Aerospace Technology Innovation, is out there as a vehicle. Those two have, this is something I think about, because capital dollars, yeah, good. Operating dollars, yeah, good. Capital and operating dollars, 1 + 1 = 3. You know, and so ways that we could be better coordinated with our joint centers, or start thinking about, because of course aerospace has a clean energy dimension to it, you know, 2.5% of greenhouse gases, and of course JC Dream has a variety of earth abundant materials for manufacturing, for batteries, for transportation within its, within its space. If there was some way for us to make the case that this is we're creating a research entity for our state in strategic areas, and elevate it by bringing them together as a coordinated group. That's been, I guess, my theme today, is that we are starting to create I see it happening after being in the state for 28 years. I'm seeing it happen for the first time, areas of pillars of the pieces that could be a potent underpinning for research excellence for our state and really help us do every step of the research, development, deployment, validation, conquer the world. But they're fragmented, and it's really hard. The machinery we've gotten, even if it's not our charge here, if we leave at least a kernel in this report of the ecosystem that the legislature, maybe by chance, Norma Smith wanted one thing, somebody else wanted, they came in to being in certain ways, but at the end of the day, the pieces are coming together with workforce, with JC Dream, with Clean Energy Fund, with JCOTY. We're getting something here, really.
Yeah, and I also think at JCOTY, from a very mundane standpoint, is they exist. I mean, I'm sure they have to fight for their existence a bit, but like, that place has been around. It's not that much of a big lift for when they see it. Oh, we know JCOTY, we fund it. Clean Energy Fund is not there yet. It is 100% a Governor Inslee thing. That's what we didn't talk about. Like, right now, the Clean Energy Fund exists because of Governor Inslee.
Yeah.
And if Governor Inslee's gone, it's probably gone.
Well, JCOTY has a separate budget. JCOTY has a budget, which I think is like the Aerospace Innovation Fund or something, just like the workforce now has a budget that was the Amazon Microsoft budget, for the extra thing. JCOTY has a budget out of some sort of innovation pot of money for aerospace. It was part of, I think, keeping the 777X or something.
Yeah.
Some program was
non-tax piece.
Exactly. And so this, I think, to me, is a critical part of a next level strategy beyond what we've got, is sort of how did that funding get created? How do we, out of CETA, we've got innovation projects in CETA. Now, unfortunately, ecology is going to decide whether an innovation project meets the carbon goals for the offsets and stuff, and so now there's another agency that's kind of stirred in there, but they also can pay in at certain rates depending upon the source of their emissions. And maybe it's legislatively mandated now, or in the rulemaking that's happening, but where does that money go from the CETA projects that pay money?
Excellent question.
When you say a CETA project that would pay money,
the alternative compliance projects,
okay.
or you can make an alternative compliance payment. So where do the alternative compliance payments go?
Yeah, we've lost Sarah. I don't know, Kate. I don't know. If you can answer.
I don't know. I don't know if Austin's still on the call. We can track that down, but I don't think we know that.
Probably the general fund at this point, but it's an interesting thought, Dan.
And then go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that is something, I don't even know if we brought it up on this, but that's another third rail question, is like, how do we make the Clean Energy Fund evergreen? I was loath to bring it up in this group because it's probably not those kind of experts that understand how you can do that within our state government, but it is something that, again, we need to figure out. And I mean, at most states would just go to a system benefit charge, and that's probably not happening in our state unless things really change. So yeah, what is that? And those are the kind of things, like, I didn't even think about that. And I don't know that answer. It's probably already taken. But at least if we knew, hey, here is a stream of money that is going to exist in the future, we can say, hey, you should direct some of that towards this to make it an evergreen project. And that's what we need to identify, is just where the potentials of doing that are.
I mean, and I know this game much better at the federal level, obviously, but like, that's where, you know, it may or may not be in the budget baseline, depending on the time horizon as to when those projects can start. Like how CBO, for example, would go about scoring something and projecting what was in and not in the budget. OFM probably has a methodology for that. And so maybe they are or are not already, those revenues are or are not accounted for based on the time horizon that's expected. I don't know, but it'd be an interesting question. I gotta hop in a minute, but I have one other thought for you guys that I didn't have a chance to mention, but I think it was Sarah who said something about the Clean Buildings for Washington piece of this as well. And it's very early days on this, but this is one where I think also Washington might be able to distinguish itself because of McKinstry and other things, which is there's just this emerging kernel of work that's beginning around sort of pathogens in the built environment. And it's being spurred along by obviously COVID. So like just in its early days, because for example, like the Department of Energy's Better Buildings program, Building Technologies program, historically, you know, its sole metric has really been around efficiency. But what if you start considering health and productivity in the built environment is sort of an emerging area? So there are lighting applications in relation to healthcare facilities that we're beginning to be able to measure productivity, or, you know, healthcare gains or productivity gains. And now just in the last week, Office of Science is actually funding, it's like an 11 lab, blah, blah, blah consortia, but like us in Berkeley and Argonne are starting to work on basically fate and transport in the built environment. Like how will you operate HVAC systems, et cetera, differently perhaps? And there's a sensor piece to it and everything. But in the context of what the legislature might be concerned about, you know, in sort of bolstering the relevance of what energy innovation can help deliver, it might be worth, like I said, it's super early days, and it's like, you know, it's just an interesting sort of emerging front at the federal level at this point, where municipal and federal buildings and healthcare facilities and things like that will probably be on the front lines of that. But a lot to learn there.
Oddly enough, Corning just, in the last year and a half, has set up established presence in Seattle, and one of their big things is that, you've probably seen it, their air quality treatment device. I don't know what it's called, but yeah.
I need to go too. Angela, I just wanted to tell you that I neglected to mention earlier the conflict of interest question. We are looking into it. We think we can, that it's, you know, that it's, I don't even want to say we can overcome it because there's nothing to overcome. But anyway,
Right,
we
right,
are
exactly.
we do have people looking at it, so you will hear back from us. And then everyone else, thank you so much for being on, and you will hear from us again soon.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye all.